I don't know why, but I always think of elevator music.
That's the point. It's supposed to be elevator music.
Nothing wrong with elevator music.
True.
I need to make a playlist just simply titled elevator music now.
That's what I looked for to find this, but lo-fi also works.
I forget, what is the fi in lo-fi? Is it fidelity?
Yeah, it is, I think. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Yeah, so a couple of reminders. You can find the questions log weblab.2/questions and ask for help on weblab.2/Q. And yeah, okay. So very importantly, today at midnight EST, so 11:59, milestone 0 is due. So basically, this one is where you submit 10 ideas. Only the first 3 have to be like actually fleshed out, like more like a couple sentences, while the other 7 can just be like 1 sentence. And you need to form your team by then too. This is you can have a team of up to 3. 1-person teams are okay, 2-person teams are okay, 3-person teams are okay. And yeah. So you have to, as a reminder, you need to complete all the milestones to receive credit or enter the competition. So make sure you register on portal.web.lab.2. You can find the milestone 0 form there. You can find it on Piazza, but make sure you submit that by tonight. And we're going to make this a hard deadline since we are very over enrolled this year. If you don't submit this milestone 0 form, we will assume you're going to drop the class, and you probably don't want that. So yeah, and regarding like amount of effort you need to put into these submissions, like you do need to put some amount of effort in since it is a 6-unit class, and we're pretty lenient on grading. So make sure you submit something on your form, like like 10 ideas. They don't have to be great. They can be a starting point, but you can't submit to us a form that says, "Sorry, I don't have any ideas," because I've seen a little bit of those already. And if you don't have a team, we will open up today's office hours as for you to come like mingle with others and help find a team. We're hosting that in GatherTown. Same thing as like last Saturday. So you can come there to look for a team. You can come there if you need help from a TA to get help about your 10 ideas. And yeah, so this will be due tonight. You can find this also on our website for more details about the milestone. But yeah, so without further ado, I will continue the lecture today. First one will be about design and wireframing. So, okay, awesome. So, why do we care about design? Can anyone tell me? Okay. Yeah, make things pretty. Aesthetics is fun. Accessibility, yeah, that's a good one. Usability. People will indeed look at your website. This is true. Graphic design is your passion. Ooh, that's a great one. And yeah, those are all correct. Basically, design will either drive your users to stay or go away. So if your design is good, you'll get more users, and people like that. If your design is bad, no one will look at your website. So today we'll teach you what makes good design and how you can like make your website get there. So have people heard of these terms before in UI UX? And if so, can you tell me what they stand for? Anyone? No? Yeah, user interface, user experience. Great. Awesome. So let's go over user interface first. So this is the design of the interface between the user and the product. It is what the user directly sees on your website. So this can be like layouts, colors, color schemes, fonts, all that stuff. So I'm gonna walk through an example of what can happen if you don't have good design, you don't have wireframes. For example, so this summer I worked on something called GatherTown. It started out looking like this. No design, no wireframes. Looks a bit, it doesn't make me feel good, looking at it. So next, we made like a couple wireframes, put together something look like this. You can tell it's like a lot better than the last one, and I'll go over into detail about what things can help make your website look better. And then finally, when we decided to make real wireframes, about like 100 of them, GatherTown looked something like this. And you can see like the very different vibes you get from these 3 different, like they all increase in quality, I think, but the last one is definitely the best one as it had a lot of fleshed out designs. It had like a design system. It had like consistent colors, consistent fonts, and the layout just felt like nice. And yeah, we also changed it to dark mode because that seems to be the standard of the internet these days. I'll give you another example. So if anyone remembers MIT really old website, it looks kind of like this. It doesn't look great either. I'll give a couple examples. Like this probably isn't the best picture to choose. It's not even centered on the page, first of all. We have this janky go button. And yeah, let me turn on my annotating tool. Okay, that didn't work, whatever. But yeah, so MIT then redesigned their website. It looks something like this now. It makes you feel good inside. But you can see they have a nav bar. They chose like a nice, cleaner font. And then like, look, they have a very nice search bar. It's like a lot easier to find information now too, versus the old one where it's like this is a lot more cleaner because people usually use nav bars for navigation, and they make the important parts of the website stand out, which is the search bar. Like people want to find information fast, so that's where they would go. And yeah, so and now I'm going to move on to user experience, so which is like experience using the product, which is a little different from UI, which is what they're viewing and seeing with their eyes. This is how like you mimic like flows between the document and like how you navigate from maybe your settings to here or to another page on the website, things like that. Like, is it product easy to use? And yeah, so here's an example. You can tell these two things look different. So like UI is definitely different. And the UX is also different. One of them, you have to like, I think, squeeze to get out. The other one, you have to like shake really hard. But two of them look different and they have different experiences on how to use it. So you can kind of think of this as like the UI and UX. So talking about visual design. So good design will convey identity. So if websites will stand out and look good and be from others if you can. So for example, let's look at this one. It looks kind of generic. Like we have like generic buttons like back to Untamed, learn more. The font's like, I think it's just a generic Arial. But yeah, and then this one looks very similar. Look, they have like the same nav bar. It's like black on the top with those links, and then they kind of also have a jumbo headline, some headings. These don't look really that different from each other. And something we'll go over is something called Bootstrap. This is a UI library that we'll go over sometime next week that we do encourage like beginners to use. But if you want your website to stand out, we recommend do your own CSS style. So Bootstrap is good for consistency in basic layouts because they have components that you can just reuse over and over, which is good on your website. And they'll help you lay out your website. They'll have easy ways to make your things align in columns, grids, whatever, things like that. But again, bad for standing out because if everyone uses this UI library, then you can imagine all of their websites look the same. So let's take a look at these. These look, this website already looks a lot different from the last ones we saw. So you can see they have their own nav bar. They took their own flair on it. So if you're on the home page, they make it blue and they underline it. So that's an example. They have a different color scheme, which is like this blue, black, and white. And they chose a different font. And yeah, if we look at this one, this is already very different from the last one. They chose to make a whole background image, like the website. I'm guessing they're trying to sell something. They also have their own font. They have the nav bar at the top and a big button here. And also this one. This one looks very different. Again, another different font, different work on the nav bar. And yeah. So things you want to keep in mind when you're designing your website is fonts. So what kind of font you choose will have an effect on your website. For example, if you use Comic Sans, that's a different vibe from if you use like Open Sans or something like that. And color palettes, you shouldn't use like really aggressive colors that hurt the user's eyes or like clashing color schemes. And you should pay attention to shapes, which is like the layouts on. Yes, Comic Sans is Tommy's favorite font. And yeah, so this is an example of a color scheme. This is one of like Google Maps, like traffic things. But you can see they chose like, they didn't use like any basic CSS colors here. So you're not gonna see them using like color blue or like color red. Those are like the really basic ones that don't look that good. They're very aggressive. But here they use like a very muted blue, another like a dull red, and then they contrast that with the orange. And it looks really good. Like you can like see the traffic and road lines here really well. And the colors here like match really well together. But yeah. So good design will also convey importance. So we're going to go to a bad example of this. So I personally don't think this is a good example of good UI because there's a lot going on here. First of all, there's a lot of text. There's a lot of colors. There's a different font for every box. Like I don't know, like I get this is about the Arrive Alive Driving Academy, but what else is there to it? Like classes fill rapidly, call now has like the same importance as like direction to classes. These two obviously probably shouldn't be together on the same page or different things, but because of the size and where they are on the page and like they convey the same importance. You probably want to make the important parts on any single page of your website stand out. So this is bad, don't do this. Now we're going to take a look at something I think looks nice, which is the Discord app. So this is a Discord homepage when you can download their app, and you can see their navbars up there. But what's important on the screen is they have two buttons here: download for Mac OS and open Discord, which is what they're trying to get you to do when you're on this web page. So you can say that they have like chat play and discovery games with your friends. This is obviously like what they're trying to sell to you. They want you to download it for this specific reason. It's like a talking app, and then they conveniently attach the download button for you to click and open. So yeah, you want something like this. It's a lot cleaner. You can see there's some white space on the left and right. It's not too cluttered. And color scheme here is good. They use like black, white, blue, a little like accents of green and yellow. And I think that's really nice. And yeah, so TLDR, bad UX. You can see on the left, it's just clutter. While good UX, it's like a lot cleaner and simpler. So, and also things you need to keep in note is like usability and learnability. And yeah, take time, we move on. Okay. So good design also conveys emotion. So remember how I talked about UX, the user experience, which is how like the user feels when they're using your product. Like, is it easy to learn? Is it intuitive? Like, so UX should make the user feel good. And this like essentially means like emotion. Do they want to come back to your website? We don't know. So you can see Airbnb's very, very old website. This is probably one of their first prototypes. It doesn't look that great. Like it's a little cluttered, a little boxy, but like when people are trying to find a place to stay, they want to feel homey. Like they want to feel like they're going to rent like they're going to be literally living like in one of these homes that they're trying to look for. So Airbnb's job as a website should be able to sell those homes as best as they can. So with the new redesign, you can see that their logo is literally like an upside down heart, and like they design like their own logo. They have like text that says "Welcome home." You know, that feels pretty homey to me, and it's like a lot more clear, a lot more visual that really help the user feel like what they're looking for. And you can see you have like start your adventure, which is like talking very specifically to the user. And it's like, we've chosen locations you'll love around the world. And then they list all these homes. And yeah, so this is how they did their logo redesign. They drew people like that. They combined like places, a little pin with a heart. And then that's kind of how this logo came about. But yeah, one more thing is like animations. So animations can really make you feel like good. So this is an example of, I think, the Twitter, like the heart react button. So you click it and literally confetti goes on the sides. Like, this is pretty fun to do. I like watching this. It makes you feel good. And yeah, so basically like the core of design is to make the user experience enjoyable and make it like visually appealing for the user to look at, because that's how you draw more users. So now we're going to talk about how you can get your websites to do that. And of course, part of this is wireframing. So does anyone know what wireframing is? And if so, you could just shout it out, put it in the chat. If not, it's fine. I'll teach you what it is. But okay. Yeah, sketches of different features, parts of the design layout. That one's good. Yeah. So basically, it's like the skeleton for the UI of your website. It's a very critical part of the design process. Again, I showed you what happens when you don't. So I would not skip this step. In fact, milestone 1 on this weekend is where you submit your wireframes for the staff to review. This should probably like encapsulate like the MVP, the core features of your product. You should have like a mock or wireframe for each like important component of your app. So yeah, it kind of looks like this. So you can see this might be a Facebook wireframe. There's nothing like very like, you can see they're laying out the news feed, the chat bar and stuff. And you can see you can have also wireframes for your mobile apps, kind of like mocks the flow of information. So it tells you if you click on this button, you should go here. It should look like this at this step, yada, yada, yada. Okay. And they should be pretty drafty. Like you should, like, this is fine. This is like, you can do it in pen and paper. Like they don't need to be that, they don't need to look like your exact website at the end. Yeah, again, mocking up the flow and layout information. So I'll talk about what the flow means. So in here, we have two different places we can navigate. We can click the alumni tab, which will probably bring us to, I don't know, like an alumni page. And then we can also enter a search in the search bar, which will also bring us to, I don't know, a search page. So let's say we go in the search place and then we enter the word donate, and brings up this thing, which is called Giving MIT. And you click on it, and then it goes here to this web page. So, however, when you click on the alumni tab, it brings you to this page. But in the alumni page, you can see they have the generously support thing, which links back to this page that we just saw, Giving to MIT. So you can see like there's a lot of different ways to get to this one page, and like wireframes can help you like control like which flows and how to get there. So for example, this would be an example of like mocking up the flow. You can connect them with arrows. So we have alumni goes to this page, and then while clicking the search bar will bring you to the search results page, clicking to Giving to MIT, they'll all bring you back to this donation page. And you can draw arrows between your different mocks to bring you to the page. Yeah, so today we'll go over briefly, how do I make a wireframe? Well, today I'll be showing you how to use Figma, which is a free tool. You guys can get, like as students, you get like an education, so it's free. You can also use Google Slides. And if you want, or if you're a pen or paper person, you can also use the good old pen and paper. So yeah, let's do it. I'll show you guys how to make something super simple. So last semester I built, me and Jessica here built an app that helps you look for restaurants, and you can filter by COVID tags. We named it Gobble Gobble. So let me bring you there now. So this is Figma, the front page. Can you guys see this? So what you do, you basically click new file, and then you get a completely new file. There's nothing here yet. So what I'm going to show you to do, we wanted like a page, kind of like Yelp, kind of like Google when you look for restaurants. You want kind of a map view, you want a list of the restaurants on the right, and you probably want a navigation bar because, I don't know, I think this makes it easy to navigate. So the first thing to do, you want to open a frame, and a frame is just kind of like, it's literally like the box if you want. They already have custom frames here for you guys. So you have like different pixel sizes here. So I usually just use MacBook Pro because that is my laptop. And yeah, it's completely blank. It looks a little intimidating, but not to worry. We will. So first of all, I think having like basic white as the background is a little aggressive. I usually like doing a nice off-white color. So even changing it just by just a little can help. Let's say I want to do a nav bar. I can easily do that by doing a rectangle and just drawing it. And I think that gray is not a good color. So maybe I want to make my nav bar, I don't know, this color. Oh God, I can't see anything. But you can also add effects here. So I encourage you to play with this. You can add like a little drop shadow, but I don't like this color. So for the nav bar, I'm going to make it a little more white. Change the background a little bit. It's a little too dark. Oh no. Okay, there we go. Okay, cool. So we also have, Figma also has a lot of like plugins you can use to get things on your website. So they have like built-in emojis that you can use or icons that you can go upon. Plugins like a map, they can literally just put a map on the screen instead of you having to like screenshot Google Maps. So let's just say we put in like MIT's address. 77 Mass Ave. We make map. Oh, pretty dope. So you can drag it to be the size you want. And you do have to keep in mind, like the order matters here. So like the way you're stacking your elements, you do have to keep in mind. I think this should go behind the nav bar. Yeah, it looks like something like that. And I can fill in the nav bar later. And maybe the next thing I want to do is to actually add like a list of restaurants here. So what I can do, let's make some text. So yeah, a text box here. And let's just have something called like Flower Bakery and Cafe. Already, this is the wrong font size. It's way too small for the page. I'm going to choose a different font that I personally like, DM Sans. And what you can do, I recommend, you can create custom text styles in Figma that they will save and you can reuse across your application. One thing I think is good is you can recreate like a reusable class, like CSS class or React class, has different levels of heading, like H1, H2, H3, that has your own personal styles in it. So in this case, let's make this medium, so a little bolder, and let's make this a little bigger. Oh, that's a little too, like 18. Okay, cool. And then you can zoom in just by pinching in or doing the scroll. Things like that. Okay, so, and then you can add text like this. So let's have this be like H3. All headers are usually cool. So. And then later on, you can just use that style by clicking it. Let's also call it, let's say it's a bakery. I'm going to move this later. I want to make this a little muted. So, because, yeah. Other things I can put, like, I don't know, their address or something. 190 Massachusetts Avenue. This is not big enough. And maybe I also put like, I don't know, a phone number here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. Okay, cool. Looks fine to me. Maybe you want to add like a heart here to have people to favorite a restaurant. So what you do is, I think what I do is look up Figma material icons. Again, this website has like everything for you. And you can kind of just open their icons and drag them over to your app. So a lot of these here, I'm going to copy them over. Yes, we stand flower here. Okay, I'm going to copy this over. Yeah. And you can, it's very similar to Google Slides. You know, when you're dragging around, you can see like the orange lines tells you when it's a line. And things you can do is you can group things together. I use shift. You can do shift and click to group it, and you can click group. And then you can kind of just drag it here. And yada, yada, yada. Oh no, okay, there we go. Cool. Great. Say maybe we actually want to filter by text. So I'm gonna move all of these down a bit. Maybe a tag I want is saying like, I want to look for only, let's say like fast food. What I can do, I leave that up there. I can have a box that surrounds it. Like I'm thinking of those little like pill tags. I'm gonna make this transparent. We're gonna remove the fill, but I'm gonna add a stroke. A stroke is what they call like a border. Oh, it's awful. I don't like that. So first of all, I'm gonna change the stroke to be something very light. Maybe not that light. Maybe a little darker. Cool, and I think it's a little too boxy. So you can just change something up here. You can see I hovered over it. It's called corner radius. So I'm gonna add like a corner radius of like, I don't know, 20. Nope, that's not circling enough. 24. Cool. And I probably want the pills to look a little more standouty. So I might fill this rectangle here with white. That means I need to bring this guy in front of it. And I can group these guys. Oh, God. Okay, Command G. You can do that, something like that. Yeah. Border radius is very important. Claire also agrees. I think sharp edges are kind of off-putting to a user. So if you just use like literal boxes, it's not good. It's not a good vibe. Things you can also do in Figma, there's something called prototype. This is kind of like linking your different frames together. So this is one frame, right? So we have MacBook Pro. You can rename it just by double clicking it. For sake of time, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, this I just showed you like how to basically make a frame. There's a lot of good Figma tutorials out there. I'm not a power user of this by any chance, but I think once you know how to create something that looks sort of decent, like your website will start being in a good place. So like examples is you can start making even bigger wireframes. So you can see these are all linked, and you can make reusable components. So you can see here, if it has these little 4 dots, it's a component. So if I edit one of these and I had copied it into other places, it'll edit that place too, which is pretty dope. And once you set up the prototype, so if I click this, look at all the arrows between my app. So you can see that, the login and the sign up both lead to the dashboard, things like that. And you can connect these with the prototype tool by simply clicking on it and adding it here. I can go over this more in detail in office hours, or you can look up Figma tutorials online. That is the best way to learn. But yeah, this will conclude the wireframing lecture. But you can find more resources on our resources tab on the web.lab MIT.edu website, and you will need to submit some version of wireframes on Saturday, which is milestone 1. And if you think Figma is too hard to use, you can also use Google Slides, or you can use pen and paper. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Jenny. I can set mine up. Let's pull this up. Okay. There we go. Alrighty. Okay. Alrighty, everyone. Great. So today is a very exciting day because we're now starting to transition to React.js. So today we'll be doing an introductory lecture for the next hour, and then we'll be doing a workshop later this afternoon to get familiar with Catbook and implementing Catbook using React. So you've heard us mention React in the past couple of days, and now we're going to dive deeper into understanding React. And so before we get started, if you ever have any questions or get lost or anything, right, we have the questions doc, web.lab.2/questions. And then we also have the help queue, which is web.lab.2/queue. And you can just get help from a staff member. So throughout this lecture, there's going to be three big terms that we're going to introduce that you're going to be hearing a lot. And I'll kind of emphasize when we're talking about each term. But the goal is that it's really important for you just to get like a basic grasp of where it is. And we'll continue iterating on these concepts and these practices later today in a workshop, and then tomorrow as well with more lectures and workshops. So if you're still unclear, that's fine. You can always ask on the question doc, but I'll kind of emphasize when we get to there. So let's kind of recap what we've been doing for the past couple of days. So on Monday, we started by introducing HTML and working with different semantic tags like divs and spans and sections and IMG, images is IMG, right? All of these cool tags that run in HTML, right? And they have the carets to have the tags, right? And then we also talked about CSS. So we could create, CSS is a style sheet language that helped us design our elements. And we can create margin styles, font size changes, color changes, things like that. And then yesterday we were talking about JavaScript, right? And we're talking about bringing functionality. We introduced this idea of a callback function, right? And we'll be having more practice of that, right? And so if you remember this analogy from yesterday, we were really talking about how a website brings together HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, where HTML is like the bones that like bring structure to your site. And then the CSS is like the skin that is kind of the design and look of your website. And then JavaScript is the muscle, right? It provides functionality to your site. However, as we saw yesterday, right, when we were trying to directly manipulate HTML using JavaScript, it becomes a lot of work, right? And it's quite an outdated process and not something that is very commonly seen among web developers today, right? And the reason is because there's a lot of third-party JavaScript libraries that make it easier for us to build websites. And these libraries are in charge of, we kind of operate at a higher level, and it's in charge of converting our code at a higher level into lower level HTML code. And so that's exactly what React is. React is a JavaScript library that's used for building user interfaces. So React isn't really a new coding language, but it builds off JavaScript, and it allows us to build websites in a more broken down way, right? So first, let's just kind of take a look at some real world examples, right? You've all heard of Facebook, right? We've been showing it in a couple examples. Shannon just mentioned Airbnb, Instagram, Discord, New York Times, Code Academy, Instacart, all of these websites here, right? They all have different purposes, right? Netflix is for entertainment, Spotify is for music, Uber is for transportation, right? But there's one thing that binds them all together. There's one commonality among all of these websites, and it's that they all use React.js. They're all built in React. And so React, it's a very popular front-end library. It was actually developed by Facebook in 2013. And it's open source, meaning that other engineers, including yourself, can build more libraries on top of React. And there's another lecture I think Noah's gonna give on libraries, but just know that there's a lot of existing libraries built in React that help you build cool functionalities. So why do we use React, right? Well, first of all, it's modular, right? So it allows us to treat our website as like a bunch of pieces and smaller broken down chunks that can exist independently, but they can come together to form a website like a puzzle, right? So, and we'll kind of show like how it gets broken down, right? React is also a pretty fast language. It's pretty lightweight for us to develop. We don't have to require directly manipulating the HTML document for every single change we need. If you're from yesterday, we would do like document.getElement by ID. And then we would do like append child to add items to a list, like all of that, right? But this allows us to operate at a little bit of a higher level, so we don't have to do a lot of that manual labor. And lastly is that React is very readable. So when we start looking at the code later, you'll see that what we visually see on Chrome or on your Firefox window, whatever you see on a website, can be very easily translated and recognized into different React components, right? And we'll talk about what React components are exactly. So if you remember from Tommy's lecture on Monday, when we talked about HTML, we were talking about divs and these elements as boxes, right? We're drawing red boxes around the site, right? Well, React.js follows a very similar structure, right? Except that we call these boxes React components, right? So you'll hear a React a lot throughout the course of this class, and it's really at the heart of React. Or components, you'll hear about components a lot, and that's at the heart of React. So this is the first big term, and we'll define it a little bit more. So component, right? So a React component lets us break down a chunk of our UI into a reusable and independent piece of code. And it can be represented as like a piece of HTML code. It can also be comprised of other React components or a mix of both, right? And the one key thing about it is that React components can receive and maintain their own information, right? So now we're kind of combining HTML and JavaScript together, right? And a component, when it gets rendered into our website, it gets converted into HTML code. So that's so we're kind of building it like as mini segments of our HTML page. And so here is this example right here. Let's look at this nav bar right on Facebook, right? We can treat this entire nav bar as one component, right? And so when we're trying to think of like, how can we break down this component into smaller chunks, maybe take like 10 to 15 seconds and feel free to put in the Zoom chat or speak up, like, what are like some pieces that you think we can identify, right, in our nav bar? And if you don't know, that's really okay. Just give it like 10, 15 seconds. Kind of just like at a high level, like what are some parts to the nav bar that make up the nav bar? See, search bar, buttons, icons, direct message, Nico. Thanks, Yassine. Notification profiling, search bar, buttons to different pages, button to key down. Cool, wow, it looks like you guys are doing well. So yeah, so you guys are pretty much on it, right? So one way that we can break this down is at a high level, right? We can think of the nav bar as like 3 different sections. All right, oh, I'm back, there we go. So we have 3 different sections. So we have this left section that has someone to the icon in the search bar. And then we have this middle section that has all the buttons, right, to the different navigation links. And then we have the right section that has like the profile information, the messenger chat, the notifications, right? So like that's one way that like we as a web developer can say, all right, my task is to build the search bar component, right? And your teammate will say, all right, my task is to build the middle navigation button component. And the last teammate says, all right, I'm in charge of building the right component, right? So rather than you all working on one index.html file, you can all create and maintain your own independent components. And then the parent component, the larger navbar component, will bring them together like different pieces to a puzzle. So that's one cool thing about the design. That's when we talk about breaking down into a chunk, right? And so we can continue to expand this idea recursively, right? So we can think of, if you remember from HTML, we were kind of talking about boxes inside boxes, right? These nested boxes. Well, in React.js, we actually call them child components. And so child components really help us understand what structure we use, right? So here in these blue boxes, these are all child components to the middle component in the red, right? And the reason why we call them, why we can use components is that these 5 icons they all represent navigation links, right? They all have the same structure, right? But they might display a different icon based on what type of icon we tell it to display. And they might have a different color based on what color we tell it to display, right? But these components are just structural elements that exist that we can reuse. And in fact, if you can, you're encouraged to reuse React components. And that's kind of the one thing that makes this design a little bit easier, is that you can focus on only building one template component and then passing in information. And so we can expand that idea to the entire app. We can consider our entire website as just one component called app that represents multiple child components, right? And so we looked at one example with the nav bar, but now we can look at it to look at the entire website, right? So React apps are just components of components, right? So let's do another exercise, right? This is the Instagram web page. It's not as common as the Facebook web page, but it's really well designed. So maybe like take another 15 seconds. And what are some higher level components that we might be able to break down our app into, right? And think if you can identify like 3 big components that just make up the structure of our site, right? I see feed, stories box, stories feed, suggestions, good stories, story suggestions, nav bar, menus, nav bar, feed, user thing. Yeah, so so at a higher level, you guys are doing pretty well at this. We can see that, I'll show it with the boxes, right? We can see that we have the nav bar at the top, right? So before we were looking at just the nav bar example, but now we're looking at the entire app, and the nav bar is one child component of our app. We also have the feed on the left, and then we have this sidebar on the right. And you can continue to break down this exercise, right? The sidebar is made up of a profile link, the stories scroll view, and then the suggestions, right? So you can continue to like understand how components are broken down. And that's like something really nice about this, right? But how do we actually populate them, right? So components only tell us where certain things should be. It doesn't really tell us what content should exist, right? So my sidebar will probably look different from Shannon's sidebar, even though they're both considered a sidebar component, right? And so that's just kind of like the first overview of components, is that they are really just more structural components that can render based on what information we give them to. And so before we move on, are there any quick questions on like a component or how to recognize them? Component is like a term that you're going to hear a lot in this class. And so it's important you kind of understand its purpose. There's no set rule on how big or how small a component can be. You know, one unique feature about components is that you can localize all the functionality and information, right, to a certain component. And we'll kind of talk about how that works, right? But yeah, so, and if you have any questions that come up later, you can put it on the question doc. And that's on the question, web.lab.2/questions. So with a bunch of components, React actually uses a component tree structure to organize our different components, right? Remember, we were talking about how each component is like a piece to a puzzle. And when we bring them together to create the puzzle, that's what our website is, right? So you don't really need to know anything about how trees understand from like a computer science point. All you need to know is that the component tree structure helps us organize our components in relation to one another. And often this structure looks very similar to the visual UI that is seen on the website. And so as we said, here's a sample of our component tree. The website can be considered one component at the highest level. We call that app. So our root component is app. And app can contain multiple child components, right? So in this case, we can see that the 3 high-level components, like one level underneath app, is the nav bar and the feed and the sidebar, right? And then feed is another component, right? Feed is a component that can hold a scrollable list of posts, right? And each post is its own component, right? And a post can have a story, right? And so in this case, we're referencing story as like the content, right? Not what you think of like the 24-hour Instagram story. It's just like the content of a post. And then the comment, right? A comment is just another component that can be associated with a post, right? And so the indentations in this component tree can help us, indicate like what level the component is in the component tree. And it helps us understand the relationships, right, between components. So a parent to a child component, right? So app is the parent component of navbar, feed, and sidebar, right? And it's all relative, right? But why do we want to use a component tree, right? Well, it turns out that this componentry actually comes super helpful when we're understanding how to pass information, right? Especially from parent components to child components, right? And this diagram here uses arrows to indicate the direction at which information is passed down. And notice right now we're only talking about downward information. We'll talk about later this week on how you can pass information back or around, right? But for now, we're only talking about information going downwards, right? So how exactly do we handle this information? There's actually two key concepts of handling information. And so this is the second big term of the lecture. So the first one we talked about components, which were kind of the structural elements that we use in React to build our website. Big term number two is props. So it's probably new to you. You'll hear a lot about it and debugging and in the rest of the class, right? Props is just input information that comes from a parent component to a child component, right? So let's look at this diagram again. So props are, they're just like little pieces of information that we can pass down, right? And it's a one-way relationship, so we call it parent to child, right? Think of it as like a family tree. Our website's like a tree, right? It goes family to child. And we also say that props are immutable. So if you haven't heard that term before, all it means is that it's read only. So we can access whatever variable is in props, but if we try to reassign it, it's not going to change it in the parent. So that's when we say, so if you're ever trying to like, you're in navbar, right? And you hit log out and you want to tell the entire app that you're logged out. You can't just do this.props. Like logged in user is equal to no, because you're reassigning something that is immutable. It's read only, so you can't reassign it. And so we'll talk about later this week on how you can communicate upwards, right? But for now, just know that the props are like your inputs that come into a component. And so what do they look like? Well, what can be passed down? You can pass down a JavaScript object, Boolean variables, IDs, text, numbers, functions, all the JavaScript primitive types, right? Pretty much anything and everything can be a prop. You can also pass down other components. This is a rare case, and usually there's a better way that you can structure your React code, so that way maybe the child component already has the component. But there are some occasions where you might want to pass it in as a prop, or sometimes it's easier or whatever. But just know that this is a rare case, but it is possible to do. It's just not as common as other props that we use. So that's pretty much the overview to props. We'll have more practice when we start looking at the code and in the workshop later. But just remember at a high level that these are the inputs to a component. They are passed down from a higher level component to a lower level component, and you can't change them, right? And one quick thing as well, you can pass down props the entire way down, right? You can have some prop at nav, and you can continue to pass it down into feed, and feed can continue to pass it down into post and continue to pass it down into story. It's not limited to just one level, right? But usually you want to structure it so that way whatever component needs the information will generate that information, right? So like the app doesn't need to know every single comment on a post, right? But maybe the post component can generate the comments that go with that post, right? That's just one thing to keep in mind when you're working with props. So that's big word number two. So first one we talked about was components, just kind of the structural elements of React. And then we talked about props, which is the input information we pass down. And then the next big word that we're going to introduce is state. And this is going to be the last one for today, the third big term for today's state. State is a little bit different from props, but it's another way of handling information. State is private information that is maintained and updated by a singular component. So it's pretty much private and it's specific to one component. No parent component can access the state of a child component. That's something that's like really important. And state is pretty common when you're trying to handle input changes of a component, right? So this example here, right? Let's say you have a form and you're asking your user, what do you like, right? And you have a list of checkboxes that say, I have a bike, I have a car, I have a boat, right? And they can click which one that they like, right? And each individual checkbox can be associated with the state variable. So checked one might be the Boolean status for the first checkbox item. checked 2 can be for the second one, checked 3 can be for the third one, right? And we can maintain them in an object, right? So checked 1 is equal to false, checked 2 is true, and checked 3 is also true. And so let's say this is inside like a login form or some form component, right? But that component is inside our app component, right? Well, remember how we're saying that state is private and cannot be accessed by any other component, right? So the app component cannot access the state of a checkbox, right? So that's something that's really important about state, is that you want to be careful about where you want to define variables, because if you ever have 2 components or more than multiple components that need the same variable, you would want to store the shared data in the common ancestor, right? Sometimes it's state, sometimes it can be something a little higher level, like in the feed example has all the posts, right? But that's just something to keep in mind. Components also have initial states. So whenever you create a React component, it always has an initial state, right? And for this example, maybe we want to initialize the state to all be false, right? So it's none of the checkbox, and usually that's pretty standard, right? When you see a form, like nothing's already filled in, right? When you fill in a Google form, everything is pretty much empty, and it's up to you to enter in your answers to a Google form, right? So the initial state is like an empty string or a false Boolean variable, things like that, right? And we said that components can manage their own state, but they can also maintain their own state. So we can write functions that update the state of a component. And we'll talk about that later, right? But yeah, are there any quick questions on state? And so we've talked about props and state. Both of them are ways that we can manage information in our web app. But they're a little bit different in terms of when we use them, right? So a common phrase that we use is that you want to make states stay. So they're stayed in a component, they stay in a component, but you can make props pass. Usually it's downwards. So you pass information downwards to a lower level component. So let's kind of recap what we've talked about so far. We introduced this idea of a component. So a component lets you break down like a chunk or piece of your UI into a reusable and independent piece of code. So it's like little pieces of the puzzle that we can bring together. And it can be represented as HTML code, or a component can be made up of other components. As we saw, app is made up of like the navbar component. It's also made up of the feed component. It also has the sidebar component, right? And it can be made up of both. We talked about how components can receive information using props. So props are the input, and they can also maintain their own information, their own state, pretty much like the state of the component. And React uses the component tree structure to organize our components and to pass information. And this component tree structure is very similar to what we saw on a Google side stuff, or on our Google Chrome tab, sorry. So yeah, and so each component takes in props as inputs, and props always go downwards, and then it manages its own state, which is like private information. And it's private to its own component. So if you're ever like working in your own component, you have access to state. It's not like an encrypted variable, but any component outside of it cannot access it. And then, yeah. So there's a question, do we ever need to pass information upwards? Yeah, Nick said he answered on the question. Short answer is yes, you can. You use functions for that, specifically callback functions. We're not going to teach it today because this is more introductory to React, but you'll have more practice with it tomorrow and Friday and next week as well. But yes, it does happen, and it's pretty common. So if you're so confused on how all these work, right? Well, let's take an analogy, right? Let's look at a hotel. So after taking web.lab, this IAP, you're actually hired by a hotel to build a dashboard on a website, right? And luckily the web.lab staff has just taught you everything and anything you need to know about building a fully functional website in React. And so there's a couple of key features about this hotel. There are 3 different room types. The first one is a single room that has 1 bed. Then we have a double room that has 2 beds. And lastly, we have a family room that has multiple beds and rooms to fit more people, right? And your goal is to create a dashboard that indicates how many rooms of each type there are and how many of them are vacant, meaning no one's currently sleeping in them, and we can assign any guest that walks in the door to that room. So here are the 3 room types again. And so luckily your teammate was also hired by this hotel, and your teammate also took web.lab, and they learned how to build a wireframe from Shannon's wireframing lecture. And they already built the UI. So here is what the UI will look like. It consists of a dashboard, which is this gray box here. And it has a bunch of room for it has a bunch of different rooms that each have a picture with them to indicate what type of room we have. And it has a room number to indicate where in the hotel this room is, right? And one key feature about this UI is that it actually changes color. The room picture will change color to indicate that someone is currently in that room. It's currently occupied. So if it's a darker color, that means someone is in that room, and the hotel staff should not tell someone to go to that room. So with this UI ready, it's up to you to figure out how you want to build this app. And so for purposes of this analogy, we're not focusing on like the JavaScript functions, on like maintaining this website. We're still just talking about how do we structure our components and how do we pass information between them. So don't worry about doing any JavaScript functionality right now. So the first thing we want to ask ourselves is what does our componentry look like, right? What are some components that we can create that we can use, right? So I'll go back and I'll leave this UI up for maybe like 30 seconds. So start thinking about what are some reusable components that currently exist in our app that we can reuse. And if you want to put in the Zoom chat or speak up, you're welcome to. I'll give you like 30 seconds to think about it. So the room, see room component, make a template for each room type. Yep, you're all on the right track. Yeah, so someone actually suggested we could make a template for each room type, right? That's a great choice. I will even expand that further, and I'll say you can just make a singular room component and just pass in information to that room component to tell it what type it is, right? So remember that React component is just like a structural element. It's just a template, right? It's not dictated by what content it has. So when we pass in information, it will, the look of the component is dependent on what information it has. And you can make static components, but then you're kind of remaking components and kind of defeats the purpose of this idea of reusability and modularity in React. So it still could work, but you can continue to expand that to just one room component. But either work, right? So let's look at our componentry here. So remember, we have the app at the root, that's our website. And then we have a dashboard. And our dashboard will contain all of the room components, right? So let's go back to the UI. And so just take a second to see we have a dashboard, and the dashboard has a bunch of child components that have rooms, right? And so if we go back to the UI, we can see that that component tree structure is very similar to like what the look of our app looks like, right? We have the dashboard component that has a bunch of child components that are the room components, right? And so that's when we're starting to talk about how React is a very readable language, that we can convert what components we have into an actual visual structure of our app. So the room component is what we want to focus on. So let's talk about information management. So we talked about props, right? And props is kind of this read-only input information, right? So we have 3 pieces of information. We have room type, room number, room type, and vacancy status. So kind of multiple choice question, which of these pieces of information do you think should be a prop? Meaning that the parent component is passing this information into the room component. I'll give you like 15 seconds for this. Yeah, C, people think it's vacancy status. Someone says number and type. Yeah. So the correct answer here is yeah, someone said room number and type. Vacancy set. Oh, someone's getting ahead. So the correct answer here is the room number and the room type. Remember that the prop component is read-only, right? So we're not updating, like, unless like the hotel's getting a remodel and we have to redefine numbers and change rooms, right? But that's not really common, right? So this information is kind of predefined. It might exist on a database, or it's just some fixed information that we pass into each instance of a room component, right? So each room will have a room number and it will have a room type. And it could be a single room, a double room, or a family room, right? And we might be thinking, why is vacancy status not a prop, right? Well, when someone checks in or checks out, we need to update the status of it, right? And we remember that props are read-only, they're immutable. So we can't change them, but if we create a state variable called like vacancy or something, then we can maintain it that way and continue to update it without running into any issues. So here's what the component tree looks like. So the dashboard component will have a list of all the rooms, and for each item in our list, it'll create a room component and it'll pass in props to each one. So it'll pass in a room number prop, which is an integer, and it'll pass in a room type prop, which is a string. So that's kind of like the structure of props here. And so yeah, so this is just kind of the structure of room components. Right now, so we're only talking about passing information downwards. The key thing about props is that we also know it's independent, right? So this first room component cannot access sorry, it cannot it's like input, right? So it can't change its own props, right? So if I'm a room, right, and I'm assigned to room 100, right, I can't say, oh, I'm going to actually change myself to 101 because it's a prop variable, it's read-only, it's something that's predefined at a higher level component. And in this case, it is the dashboard component. Yeah, someone asked, is props short? Yeah, it's basically like the properties, right? We just call it props or a prop variable, a prop value. That's kind of pretty common across React. And so now we were talking about state. So I think we already talked about this, right? Now we're trying to think of like private, localized, and independent information that cannot be accessed or changed by another component. And one thing that this word private might be a little bit confusing. It's private to any component outside of it, right? If I'm my component, right? If I'm my own room component, I can check and access my state variables, and I can actually change what I look like based on what variable I have, right? That's the beauty about React, is that React components will react based on the information that it has. So if the state changes, right, it can be like, oh, I'm no longer vacant, right? So when we're thinking about what state do we want to track, in this case, we want to track the vacancy status. And we want to check if someone is living there. And remember from the UI at the beginning, if someone is living in a room, then the image gets shaded in, right? And then when someone checks out, it's now in full color. So that's kind of how we manage props and state. And state can continue to update. So when someone checks out, we'll say, is vacant is equal to false, right? So we can represent props and state as different variables for our components. So now we have this new variable called is vacant, and it's a Boolean variable. So it'll be true when no one is in the room and it's clean and we can assign someone to that room, and it'll be false when someone is living in the room. And so we can understand the props and state of each component, excuse me, as JavaScript objects, right? We were talking about objects yesterday and how they behave very similar to Python dictionaries, if you've used those before, or hash maps in Java. But props here is just a JavaScript object that we can access. Props.room number is an integer value to indicate the room number, and props.room type is a string value to indicate what type of room we have. And then state is vacant is just a Boolean variable that we can access, we can read from, and we can also update it. We can write to it, right? We can switch it between true and false. So when we bring it back together to the component tree, we have the hotel app, and this should be app, but it's like the hotel app, right? And it has a dashboard, and the dashboard has room component that takes in two prop variables, a room number and a room type, and it has a state, which tells us if it's vacant or not. So that's kind of like another way to think about props and state and components. We'll have more practice with this later today when we do a workshop, and we'll continue to talk more about these ideas. But these are kind of the big three terms that you should try to get out of this lecture is what components are. It's like the structural elements of our app. Props is like the input information that's defined by our parent component, send it to the child. And then state, which is just some value or variable that we can access and maintain and update. And so as I said earlier, we want to make states stay, and we want to make props pass. And usually we pass it downwards. So now we're going to move on into like talking about how we write JavaScript components, right? So we've been talking about these concepts of componentry structure, prop, state, right? But what do they look like in actual code? So let's kind of just go through a couple of code snippets to get you familiar with it. So JSX is a syntax extension that basically, at a higher level, it just allows us to write HTML code, HTML-like code snippets in JavaScript files. And we'll kind of show you how that is. Normally, you can't write like HTML code, like divs with like the tags, the self-enclosing tags in JavaScript, right? Because it's a different language, it doesn't know how to compile it, right? But JSX is a syntax extension that allows us to do it. So we'll kind of show you how that works. So this is a component. This is that comment component. Remember, we're talking about like the feed and the post has like a story and a component and a comment, right? And we represent components as classes in JavaScript, right? So you might, this is kind of similar to how we've seen classes in Python, or if you've done other class-oriented programming, right? But they're a little bit different, right? They are JavaScript classes, but we call them like components. They're actually React components, but we just build them in the class structure. So anytime you write a component file, you need to import React and component from the React library, right? And so if you, what this notation does is importing the React exported package, and then it's also exporting like a smaller package called component that we use, right? And so the class has two functions that we're going to start talking about. We're going to talk about a couple more later this week. But the first method we're going to talk about is constructor, right? And constructor is basically what helps us initialize our app, right? This will run when we first declare and initialize our app. It's very similar to like a init in Python, or the constructor if you coded in Java before. It takes in props. So remember, props are like the inputs that come into a component. But because this is a React component, we actually initialize these components a little bit differently, right? So normally in Python, you would do like C1 is equal to new comment, right? Or in Java, you might do comment C1 equals new comment, right? That's actually not how we initialize React components. In fact, that's like pretty much no one does that for React development. It might still work, but like I would avoid it because that's just not the way that you declare them. And so this is like a big no-no. Instead, we use the self-enclosing syntax tag, right? Notice we don't need new. We can just declare it as let C1 equals with the self-enclosing tag, and then we put whatever the name of the component is, right? So here we have the comment component. And so now we can reference C1. It's just like this is an instance of our comment component, right? So that's just something, that's how we like kind of initialize and reference it. And this is when we were talking about writing HTML-like code inside of a JavaScript file. This is running inside a JavaScript file. So if we go back to our comment class, let's first talk about constructor, right? So constructor and render are these predefined functions that actually come from the component superclass. And so, we actually call these lifecycle methods, kind of already said. We call them lifecycle methods because these functions get executed on a certain and predefined lifetime or life cycle, right? So they're called lifecycle methods. And we'll talk about more later this week. But just the two for today are constructor and render. Constructor initializes it, right? So let's take a look at what constructor an implemented version of constructor looks like. So here we have constructor. And so a couple of notes here is that props is those inputs that we pass down. It's just a parent component. So there's props. And we call on super props, which calls on the superclass of component to initialize props. And this basically helps us recognize that this class is actually a component. It's not just a regular JavaScript class. And then this is where we initialize state, right? Remember we were talking about state as an object, right? So we initialize the state, and states have initial values. So we can initialize the state in constructor, right? So here for a comment, we'll just say, if I've liked a comment, we're gonna say the initial state of it is just false, right? And it just represents if the comment's been liked or not. So that is constructor. Usually you wanna limit how much code you put inside constructor. There's a lot of other methods that you can use to do more operations, but usually your constructor, it only runs once and it's at the beginning when you initially declare your component. And it's really much more used for like variable declaration. So that's constructor. Then render is the next lifecycle method that we'll cover. So render expects a return type of HTML-like code. So that's why we have to include a return, right? Because otherwise render just will run, but it's not returning anything to the compiler. So it won't actually show up in our website because you're not returning what the output should be. You can do a lot of JavaScript operations inside render before you hit return, but for now we're only returning some predefined content, right? So we'll start off by returning a div element. So this is kind of similar to what we saw in the first 2 days with HTML. We have a div and it has an ID called cool comment, and it has a class name that has comment.text, right? Just to note is that if you remember what the CSS classes for in HTML, we use an attribute called class. But class is a reserved variable in React, so it's called class name to access the same CSS classes, right? So if you're ever like, rendering a component, but the link is just, but the styles aren't showing up, make sure you're using class name. That's super important when you're working with React, right? So class name is one keynote, and we'll continue to remind you about this. But that's just, you'll probably use class name a lot, and we'll use it in the workshop. And then what we can do is we can actually, inside the div component, we want to return the content of what our prop is, right? So let's say we can access this by calling this.props.content. And there's a couple things going on here. First, we're using this, right? Notice how we use this.state, this.props. That's because we're referencing like this instance of our component, right? So this.state represents the state of like this version of the common component. Same thing with props, right? And then we can also introduce, and then we can access it using like the dot, right? Because it's a JavaScript object. So dot content or state dot is like, this dot state dot is like, right? And here's another cool thing about React, and this is what I really enjoy. Do you see these little brackets here, right? In line 20, they're actually blue, right? And so what's actually going on here is that this is actually a mini HTML environment, right? So these parentheses in line 18 and line 22 basically open up an HTML environment, right? Right now we're using them in return, but you can use them pretty much anywhere else to like declare a variable, right? So now we're in this like HTML environment, right? But let's say you want to access a JavaScript variable, right? You can actually use the brackets again to go back to basically open up a mini JavaScript environment inside your HTML environment. So that's what's going on here, right? That's why they're blue. That's why they're not the white brackets that we see in the other lines. So this.props.content allows us to access the variable. If we don't have the bracket, then it's just going to render the string like as a string on your website, this.props.content. But when we put the brackets around it, now it's saying, hey, we're in JavaScript. Let's access the variable from our JavaScript file that's this.state.content. And it will be able to access that, assuming that props.content is passed in and defined. So that's just 2 things. As we said, lifecycle methods run on a timeline. So for now, we're just going to manage this chart. It will continue to update it more. But first, we know that constructor gets called, and it'll immediately jump into render. And so these are kind of what, when we talk about these predefined cycle timelines of our React apps. So let's do a quick sanity check. We've been talking about it a lot. So React components use constructor to access props and initialize state. So this dot state and this dot props, these are JavaScript objects that we can access. And then render is what we use to return HTML-like code. So we have to make sure we're always returning something. You can return null. That's another option. If you don't want to return anything, you can return null. But you need to return something so that way the compiler knows, okay, when I build this component, this is what it should look like, right? And then we were talking about these cool parentheses that create a mini HTML environment. And then if we're inside the HTML environment, we can use a set of brackets to go create a mini JavaScript environment, right? And this can happen because we have that JSX syntax extension at the beginning, right? And that's already included for us. So you don't have to worry about setting it up. But that's just one thing to note about that's really cool about React that you can't do in normal JavaScript files. And then lastly, we're talking about class name. So React uses a class name as an attribute for CSS classes, but in CS and HTML, we use class. So we've kind of talked about what the constructor does, what render does, what accessing props like. So we've covered constructor, render, and props, right? Now let's talk about the final kind of trifecta, or whatever the fourth item is, state, right? So let's talk about accessing state. So remember we said state is just a variable that's contained inside our component. It can be, it's private to any other component, but inside your component, you can access it and you can maintain it. So it's initialized in the constructor as an object. So we do this dot state is equal to just a set of brackets. This is just saying that there's nothing there. In the comment class example, we used is liked and we initialized it to false. They're private and they're managed by each individual component, meaning no other component, can access or update it. And we're going to introduce this cool term called conditional rendering. We're not going to do a lot with it today, but I'll just show you a quick example about it. And Kai and Claire are going to go over it later this week when we do a little bit more React. But conditional rendering basically allows us to render certain elements based on the state of a given component, right? Someone asked a question yesterday on the question doc that was like, do we need to why do we need to keep doing document dot inner HTML and updating it, right, for a given input, right? Something has changed, right? And in theory, what we can do is we can just say render this component if it works, and if not, render this other component, or do something else, right? Show something else, right? And that's pretty much the heart of React, right? Is that React will render based on, and will react to any changes it gets, and it'll render based on the current state of the component. So this allows us to really only have one component, and we don't need to have we don't need to write a lot of different versions of a component and switch them out. We can actually maintain it inside one component. So let's take an example of the render function. So it's the same thing, but now we want to introduce a like button, right? And so let's say we want to show a like button if the state of a component for is liked is equal to true. So in line 19, let like button, we're just initializing a variable. We're not, or we're declaring it, but we're not initializing it to any value. And then in line, we're doing this if else logic statement here to basically check if it's liked. We want to set the value equal to a like button component, assume it's predefined for us. And if it's not, we're going to set it to null. And by setting it to null, we're just saying don't show anything, right? And then in line 29, we will say, we will use the mini brackets to access the JavaScript variable, and we'll put like button, right? Notice that we don't need to do this dot like button because we're declaring the variable inside render. And this is pretty common. You'll have a lot of logic inside render because render is basically going to be doing all the checks on should I show this or not, right? And you could do multiple checks in one render function. That's kind of what's going on right here. But we'll continue to kind of iterate this right now because there's a little bit of an easier way to write this code. A little bit cleaner, a little bit nicer, a little bit faster. And so there's the like button, right? Notice that regardless if it has a value that's associated with the like button component, or if it's equal to null, we still want to have it inside our return statement, right? We're only returning once. That's something that's super key about React. We're not doing like if this, return that, if else, or else return this. And we can basically assign it to null. So when it compiles, it'll be, all right, I'll add whatever my content is, and if liked is false, I'll put null here. It's going to replace this with null. So it's not really going to show anything, right? But if it is like, it'll show something, right? So that's kind of like something that works out. And so this logic right here, we can simplify it, right? And so we're going to introduce this idea of a ternary operator. And a ternary operator basically says, you can assign a variable like let result. So result is our variable. And it has this cool syntax that basically says, we check our condition, and then there's a question mark. And then the first value is what we assign result to, if this condition is true. And the second value is if it's false, right? And so we use a question mark. So this is basically saying, I'm checking condition. What is condition with a question mark? If it's true, do this value. And if it's false, do the second value. And this is much nicer. And you'll learn more about this. It's okay if this is your first time seeing it. I'll show you what it looks like in code. So what we can do is we can combine the like button assignment into one line of code. Before it was like 5 lines of code. Now we can do, we're checking the state if it's liked. And you can do multiple checks in this Boolean check, right? But here we're only doing one. So we're checking the state of is liked. And if it's true, we're going to set it equal to like button. And if it's false, we're going to set it to null, right? So now, this is a much cleaner way to do it. You can still do it the old way before in this logic, right? That still works, but if you kind of want to know how to write it in a cleaner way, you can do like button here, right? So this is a much cleaner way. And I'll say that you can even clean this up even more. As we said earlier, the brackets represent inside our return statement, the mini blue brackets, basically create a JavaScript environment, right? So you can actually put this code in here in line 24, right? So we don't even have to assign it. So it'll look something like this, right? Where our render statement is just checking if it's liked, and it'll basically replace this line of code with like button, and it'll replace it with null based on the like check. So this is a little bit more advanced, but it's just like one way that we can access state, and now our component will render differently based on our certain state. And that's kind of what we talked about doing React. So we'll have more practice with this tomorrow, but this is just something to know when we're doing it in one line. Yeah, can fit in one line. So we've talked about accessing state. The last thing, or one of the last two things that we want to do is now updating state. So remember, state can be maintained and updated by a component. So the component will actually automatically render whenever the state of a component is updated, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. So how do we update state, right? So let's say we define this function called like comment, that when we click on the comment, it'll execute this function, and we want to indicate that we've liked the button, or we've liked the comment, and we want to show the like button. So, this .state is like equals true. Does anyone think this will work? And if you have no idea, that is perfectly okay. Short answer is that this does not work. And so updating state is really unique to React, that it's not just some JavaScript object. Well, it is a JavaScript object, but there's a lot more underlying work that happens with state. And so that's why updating a variable it's more than just that, right? Because we also have to re-render this component, right? We have to re-render any child component, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we have to do. And notice that we're not like doing this .state is like true, and then we're not writing render, right? We're not calling the render function. That's because React will automatically do that for us, but it'll only do it if we update the state correctly, right? So you might think, okay, well, can we just reassign what state is, right? Is this another option, right? Turns out this also does not work. We cannot do this .state is equal to, like we cannot reassign what state is, right? That's how we define it in our constructor, but whenever we're updating it, that's not how we do it, right? So you're probably getting mad at me and you're like, Nico, why are you showing us this? Like none of this works, right? So what the point of this is to show you that updating state is a very particular process and something that we need to be very careful on how we do. So how to update state correctly. So it turns out React has this cool function called this.setState. And so whenever we update the state of a component, as we said, there's a lot that's going on, right? Thanks, Jose. There's a lot more going on that you'll want to update than just updating the simple property of a JavaScript object, right? It turns out this.state is actually creating a request. It's saying like, hey, React, hey, JavaScript, I want you to change this variable, but I'm going to send you a lot of other requests in the behind the scenes that you need to do. You need to re-render this component. You need to re-render any child component. You need to re-render any child component of that child component, right? And if we're passing down props to any child components with the state variable, it has to re-render, right? So let's think about when you log out of an app, right? Usually a piece of information, like if you're logged in, is held at the very top because it basically affects your entire website, right? And what happens when you log out? Usually you lose access to all of you log out of Gmail, right? And then you lose access to your inbox, right? It only shows you the login page. Well, that's expected. And what's happening is that we're actually updating the state of our app at the very highest level, and it's re-rendering every single component. It's really only re-rendering like our main component, right? Because it's basically saying, don't show inbox, right? Show only login. Think of set state as it's just sending a request to do a lot of operations, but after it, the state will be updated, right? And because it's a request, and I think Noah's going to talk about this at the end of the day, we don't know when that request is going to be finished. So we call that an asynchronous request, right? Don't need to worry about it for today. Just know that if you do this.setState and then you try to access the state variable, like in the line right after it, we're not guaranteed to know if it's been updated or not, right? Because we don't know if it only needs to render one component or if it needs to render a bunch of child components. And so this is the proper way of doing it. I think Kai and Claire are going to show more examples on how to do it where you can check the current state, right? But this is what we want to do. For when we like the comment, this.setState is liked is true, right? And so we're basically saying this is what the new state should be, right? And notice that we only have one variable in this component, right? When we get into talking about more variables, we'll talk about how you can how to selectively update certain variables. But for now, you don't need to worry about that. We're only focusing on one comment, but just know that it can expand into that. So we run this.setState is like true. And then when that runs, we will basically re-render the component. And then if we want to attach that function, so let's say when we click on the comment component, we can use this onClick attribute, right? We were talking about onClick events yesterday when we were talking about JavaScript. OnClick basically says, when I click on this div element, execute this function, right? And it's executing this callback function that is this.LikeComment, which is what we defined in the previous slide. So we define LikeComment as this arrow function. It doesn't really take in any parameters, but when we call on it, this.setState is liked is true. And we can associate it with whenever we click on this div element, we want that function to execute. So at the end of the day, this is what our comment, I think I misspelled it. This is what our comment component looks like. We have our constructor that called super on props to basically convert this JavaScript class into a React component. We initialize a state, this.state as a JavaScript object. We created a function called LikeComment that will update the state of isLiked, and it actually does this.setState of isLiked is true. And then we have our render function. So render will return, it always has to return HTML-like code. Remember that the parentheses allow us to create an HTML environment, and then the brackets inside the HTML environment allow us to access JavaScript variables. And then to review this ternary operator, this is basically saying this.state.isLiked. It's checking this condition with this question mark. So it's like, is it liked? And if it's true, if it is liked, return the like button. And if it's not, just return null. So notice how we're not even using return at all. I don't think I mentioned this. kind of hiding it. There's at the bottom, you always have to export your component. So it says export default comment. Your React, so notice how we're importing and exporting, right? We're importing and exporting whatever we tell it to, right? So here we're saying export comment, right? And then any other component can do import comment, right? And it will create a component class, but it doesn't have to worry about doing comment, that instance of comment dot like comment, right? Because everything is handled inside this component. So that's what we talk about when we're saying it's modular. We only have to worry about like this comment does not really care about what's in the post or what's in the story or what's in the nav bar, right? It's very modular, right? And it's very readable, right? This component, we can see it has the content. It has some styling to it. It has an ID. It tells us what happens when we click on it. And then this will just tell us, if liked is true, then show the like button. And if not, we'll return null. Just going back to that lifecycle timeline, constructor runs when we first, initialize our component. Then render gets called. And then anytime we change state, and we have to make sure we're using set state, it'll render, automatically re-render this component. And it'll also make sure it handles render for any child component. So we don't really have to worry about that. And yeah, I think, so we've talked about a lot. This is kind of pretty much the end of this lecture. So we've talked about why we use React.js. It's much more modern, it's faster, it's more modular, it's a more modern way of web development. We've introduced the three big terms. Components are the structural elements of React. And we talked about how we can use a component tree structure to organize them and pass in information. Props was the second big term. That's like the data that's input. And then state is the last one, which is the private information that is maintained inside a component. We looked at what writing JavaScript components look like using the lifecycle methods of constructor and render. And we talked about accessing props and state using this dot props and this dot state. And then we can update state using this dot set state. So we've done a lot. I think we're gonna break for lunch soon. So we'll be back at 3 p.m. Eastern or 3:05, one of the times. If you have any questions, you're still stuck, definitely ask on the questions doc, maybe add yourself to the queue, we can help you out. These slides are on the website right now. So if you missed something, it's web.lab.mit.edu. And then when we start at the workshop, we're going to do a workshop after this. We are going to make sure you have VS Code open with Capbook React, because we're going to continue to iterate that. If you're stuck on Git, on Capbook, on VS Code, definitely add yourself to the queue. And I can make sure I'll reshare and one quick update from Claire. If you need to join the breakout rooms, make sure you use for help from staff. We've reserved breakout room 22 to 28 for like direct staff. And you can claim the other breakout rooms. I think there's like a piazza post. But that's all I had. Thanks for sticking around. We'll be back like 3:05. Yeah, thanks everyone. Now I'll leave this here.
Thank you.
Did someone just copy like the Tommy scheduling and then change the at Tommy to at Kai?
What's happening?
Kai, can I send you a message by carrier pigeon?
Yes.
Okay, good to know.
source of weather information 24 hours a day.
Hey, good evening. You're watching the Weather Channel here on a Friday evening. Keep Questless, Jeanette Jones, and as we look out there, Jeanette, looks like it's going to be
All right, I think we'll get started shortly. Let me just pull up this slide deck. 1 second. So if you're just joining us, we're gonna move on to workshop number 2. Let me get this up here. And then I'm gonna also pull this kit. Okay. Cool. Let me share my screen. I can stop. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. So for the next hour, we're going to be building Caphook in React. And so I think the breakout rooms are open, or they should be open soon. If you want to work in them, you can, or if you have any questions, you can join the help queue and just choose a breakout room 22 to 28. And of course, we also have the question doc, web.lab.2/questions. Before we get started, I realized I forgot to mention like how we can reference prop. We're only talking about a component specific, but what does the parent component look like? So I'm just going to show you a quick code snippet of like what the post class would be. So this is post is like the parent component over comment. So the way that they interact with each other is that we define another component called a post. And we will import the comment component. Remember that every component needs to be exported. So here we're doing export default component. So here we're importing the comment. And then in render, we just reference it, right? So here are 3 different instances of the comment component. And whenever we pass in props, the props is just like very similar to an HTML attribute, and we set it equal to the value of the prop. So inside the comment class, we were doing this.props.content, and so we set the content as an attribute. So this is just like one way that like so the post is the parent component, and it communicates with the child component. We'll have practice with writing these. I just wanted to show you what an example looks like, so you kind of understand, what the level above looks like. So why don't we get started? Everyone can go to web.lab.2/profile. So at the end of this workshop, this is our goal. And here, let me actually show that here. This is what we're going to be developing, not all of it, a certain piece of it, right? We're going to be building Caphook in React. And by the end of this workshop, we're going to introduce this new cat happiness component. And the way it works is that anytime we click on the picture, it'll increase. I'm clicking on the picture right now. It will increase our cat happiness value, right? So that's the end goal of the workshop. So we built Caphook in static HTML and CSS on Monday. Now we're going to basically be converting that into React and adding this cat happiness component, and we'll have it update the counter every time you click on your picture. So let's go back to the slides. Everyone should have Caphook React open in VS Code. So launch VS Code. When you're in VS Code, you can open up Caphook React, that Caphook React folder, and then you want to open up a terminal window in VS Code. You can create a separate one like on its own, and you can use the CD command to like navigate to your Caphook React folder. But if you open it in VS Code and you open up a terminal window, it's already there for you. So I'm gonna do it here, and I'll try to be careful on how we do this, right? So this is Caphook React. This is all the code from the workshop. Here, let me increase the size of this. This is all the code from the first workshop. On my Mac, there's like a terminal window. I think it's the same like on a Windows. You should see like a terminal window menu at the top, and you can hit New Terminal, and then it'll populate your terminal at the bottom. And notice that it tells us we're in the Caphook React folder. So we can run git status, and it tells us that we are on branch workshop 1 complete. So this is from yesterday. And so we'll be doing, we'll be working on workshop 2. So once it's open, you want to run these couple commands. So I'll leave this up for like a minute. Git fetch is going to allow you to basically get the most recent updates on the branch. We're going to do git reset hard to basically clear any changes we made. And then we're going to do git checkout w2-starter. And then you're going to do npm install. So npm install, what that does is that React is a node package, right? And we want to run this npm install because we've listed on the W2 starter branch, there's a file called package.json. You don't really need to know what it does, right? It's automatically updated for you. Just know that that's basically what tells us what packages we need for our app. And React is one of them. So we run npm install and it will locally include all of them. And if this command npm install does not work, if it's saying npm is not recognized, that means you don't have Node installed on your computer. And there's a development guide. You have to install Node. There's a development guide. You should have done it for the setup, but if you haven't, there's a development guide on Piazza. And if you still need help, definitely join the queue because we're going to be using npm a lot. So I'll leave this here maybe for like another 10 seconds and I'll go with you. So git fetch, git reset, space -- hard, and then git checkout w2-starter, and then npm install. So I will do them here. So I'm going to do git fetch. Let's see if I can make this obnoxiously. Okay. Let me just clear this. Okay, we're going to do git fetch. And so now we've updated it, right? We're going to do git reset space -- hard. And then we're going to do git checkout w2-starter. And then we're going to do npm install. And the npm install is going to run a script to install our dependencies. You don't need to worry about what it does. Just know that when we're using React, we're using a bunch of packages. Like React is a package that basically help build and compile our app. And so they're located in the package.json folder if you're interested in them, but it basically locally installs them. So it's going to run the script and then it should work. And if you're not here, join the help queue. If npm is not working, you need to get that result fixed. So join the help queue and the staff can help you out. So let's move on and let's get started. So let's look at the component tree for Catbook. So this is an app.js. Remember, we were talking about our websites are just one component at the top called app. And we have a higher level component called navbar and another higher level component called profile. And we're going to be adding the cat happiness component to the profile later on, right? So we're at the starter step. So if we open up app.js, this is from an old exercise. Okay, so app.js, and I'm going to close this for now. So this is already set up for you and it's commented, right? And this is very similar, right? We have these HTML-like tags. Remember, we were using class name. Class name is specific to React, and it's different than class. And then we do, so the first higher level component is navbar, and then the second one is profile. Yeah, oh yeah, I did a short command. I guess I can show you how to do it. So you should see on the left, you shouldn't have comment and post, I just added those. But in the client folder, there's two ways you can do it. I'm on a Mac. You can do a file. So I did Control-T, I believe, and you remove the tag, and it's kind of like the search bar, and you can type in app.js. If you don't know how to go to it, if you don't know how to do that, go into your file explorer. It's the little file window on the left. Go into the client, then src stands for source, and then components, which is like all the React components we're writing, and then it should be in the components folder, app.js. So app.js will render. Notice how we don't really have a constructor. It depends. You can't have it for an app. It's definitely more common for lower level components, but for apps, it's at the top. It gets attached to our web page through the compiler, through index.js, but you don't need to worry about that for now. But here's our render function. And we always have to return something in render. We have to return what does app look like in an HTML code setting, right? And our app is not 4 or 5 lines of code. It's comprised of the navbar, right? And so by including navbar here, it's going to say, okay, include whatever is exported as the navbar component. So it's going to take the output of render of navbar, and same thing for profile, right? That's what's going on here. We're going to do a couple exercises. So why don't we look at the profile.js? So if you want to do the same command, you can do the search bar, or this will be, here, I'll show you here. So now instead of components, inside the components folder, we're going to go into modules. And so modules has, or sorry, not modules, sorry, pages. Modules is right after this, pages. And pages has the profile.js. So we're looking at the profile page. So after this, we'll go into modules. But right now, we're just looking at pages, right? So this is a profile page, right? And if you look at it, right, this code is very similar to pretty much almost exactly the same thing as what we did in workshop 0 or workshop, whenever we built Catbook in HTML. It's very much the same HTML code, right? And so we're going to be updating this profile component, but feel free to take a look at it. I'm going to go on the slides here and just kind of walk you through what's going on. We have our constructor that takes in props, and then we're going to call super props, which basically calls on the super class that we extend, which is component. And then profile has a render method, right? And so we can think of this code as like different sections of our website. So at the beginning, you have your avatar, right? The avatar is like the profile picture. And then the next section we have is like our name, and then we have the horizontal line. HR is like the horizontal line. So one thing you can do is you can actually replace your name here with your own name if you want. And then we have a flex container here that has two subcomponents. So the first one is the about me subcomponent, and that kind of has its own description. And then the second one has another component that talks about my favorite cat, my favorite type of cat. So that's what's going on in the profile page. And so in order to run our code, right, so these are JavaScript files, but how do we open them in a Chrome tab, right? You want to run this command, npx webpack, and do this in the terminal that's in your Catbook React folder. And what you want to do is that anytime you save changes, right? If you remember from the first lecture, you would save changes on your HTML file and then hard refresh or just refresh on your Chrome or Firefox window that HTML file, right? But that's like a lot of work, right? We're making a lot of changes. And so when we were just doing HTML, it was fine because all we had to do was hit save and then refresh, right? But here, it can be very tedious to make a change on your local code. And then we have to rerun this command, npx webpack. And npx webpack actually takes a while because it's building it's putting together all your components and bundling them up together and creating a new file called index.html. We're actually telling it where to go out. So you want to try to find this folder, go into the client folder. There's a subfolder called dist, stands for distribution. And inside there is an index.html file. And so that file is going to represent like what our code is in HTML, and it'll have all the scripts that work, right? So your command is npx webpack. I'll do it here. Let's get that terminal back. Npx webpack. It's going to take a while, kind of slow. Wait, mine is still running. Yep. So it ran and it finished running. And it created this new folder dist, right? This green folder, right? And inside here, there's now an index.html file. So we want to open this. So I'm going to drag this into my Chrome browser. Let me actually pull it here. So now it looks like this, right? And it's built. But notice that when you try to edit like a change in profile.js and refresh this page, it's not going to instantly update. Because what we're doing is we're building the JavaScript files into HTML code. And so because of that, that's kind of a slow and inefficient process. So we built a process, or there's already a predefined way to get it started. So instead, we've kind of set up these tools for you. We're combining a Webpack and Babel loader to basically like load your content. And we're combining it with this plugin called the React Hot Loader. And basically all you need to know is that when we combine these, it allows us to basically view our updates live on a local host port. And so the way that that works is that you want to run this command. So we already ran npx webpack in one terminal, right? And it executed, right? And it finished. Now run npm hot loader, but you notice it's not gonna like finish and say, all right, enter a new command, right? Because what it's actually doing is it's creating a hot, we call it the hot loader. And all it's doing is that it's constantly sending live updates to your local host machine at port 5000. So you can access that in Chrome. So I'll leave this up for like maybe another 10 seconds. Run npm space run space hot loader as one word. And when we run it, all we have to do is open up a Chrome tab. We don't need to drag index.html into our Chrome tab anymore. So I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to do npm run hot loader. And so it's running a script, right? It's telling us that the project is running. Oh, well, we kind of scrolled. Here it is. The project is running at localhost 5000. The content Webpack output, it's telling us it'll if we fail it, it has the index.html file from the client/dist folder, which is what we just saw. So we saw that it compiled successfully, and it actually it's still running, right? So it's kind of this live server that's going on. So I'm going to go back to my Chrome tab, and now I'm going to do localhost 5000. And so now, so it's pretty much the exact same thing, but now there's live updates. This will live update anytime you make a change, right? So let's make a change by maybe changing your name, right? So under your name here, so the way you want to do that is you want to go into profile.js, and in line 16, replace it with your own name and hit save. And then you'll see that it automatically compiles for you. And then if you go back to your Chrome tab, it's there for you. So just to repeat that, we are in profile.js. So we ran npm hot loader. You only need to run it once and keep it running. You shouldn't be running it multiple times, because then it's going to try to open another hot loader at port 5000, and it's going to be like, wait, something is already running there. And it'll conflict. And it'll say the address is already in use. So whenever you have a hot loader, only have one instance of it running. We opened it. You go to your Chrome tab, do localhost 5000, hit enter. It should open this file. And then in line 16, and then we're going to go into profile.js, go into line 16 and update it with your name. And when you update it with your name, it should hit save. You have to hit save, and then you'll see the terminal output automatically update, and it'll say what's been generated. And so here we saw profile.js was updated. And then we don't even need to hit refresh on Chrome. So why don't we move on to start getting into these exercises. So that's just kind of the setup that we have. You should have your hot loader running in one terminal window. Navigate to localhost 5000. And 5000 is just like a port number that we use on your local machine. I think we'll talk about this later when we get into servers. But just know that it's kind of like a little address on your computer that React is sending the changes to, so we can view them on Chrome. So why don't we start by actually writing components? We saw a little preview of them in the lecture, right? So the first exercise that we want to do is implementing a navigation bar, nav bar, right? So we already wrote a nav bar in our HTML code, but now we want to do it in React. So there's kind of two steps that we need to do. And I'll maybe give you like a minute to do, a minute and a half. And if you're still stuck on like setup, definitely join the help queue, because then you might fall a little bit behind on this. But I'll give you some time to catch up. Open up we'll start by going into navbar.js, and you'll see that there's a return method in render that we need to populate, right? I think right now it says null, and we need to implement it, right? And we want to implement it with the HTML code that we built when we first built Capbook in Workshop 0. So there's actually a file at the very top of our directory called oldindex.html. And kind of like take some time to go through the code and see if you can isolate the few lines of code that represent the navbar, and you want to put them in the return of navbar.js. Yeah, if you need help getting to navbar, I'll go back to the slide right now. But so we're going to go into the client folder, go into source, go into components, go into modules, and you should see navbar.js and navbar.css. So, and I think it should be commented out in step 0 on what you should be implementing, and we'll do it together after. So yeah, that's where that is. And then to get to the old index.html file, it's at the very top level of your Capbook React folder. It's called old_index.html and oldstyles.css. So I'll leave this slide up here, maybe give you guys a minute. Yeah, so you should be going into navbar.js, going and implementing the return. And in order to implement it, look at the old index.html file and try to look for the few lines of code that represent the navbar. I think they use like a nav tag. It's like the caret nav. And then you want to go into oldstyles.css and look for like I think there's only 2 styles that are used that are correlated to the navbar. And you want to take them from only those 2 from the oldstyles.css file and put them into navbar.css. And navbar.css is in the same folder as navbar.js. So I will give you a minute there. Hold on, question. Seen a couple of questions on the questions doc. Make sure that before you get started, make sure you ran, if you joined us a little bit late, make sure you ran npm install at the Capbook React folder. The easiest way to do that is just to open up a terminal window. Usually there's a menu bar in VS Code that allows you to link terminal. And if it's linked to your command line, you can just run npm, or no, you would run npm install from there. And if you don't have npm installed, like it's saying it doesn't know what to do with npm, that means you haven't set up your environment correctly. And there's a guide on Piazza on how to do it. I think you had to do it before class started. Yeah, the questions doc, can you see it up here? It's weblab.2/questions. And I think there's an overflow doc as well. It's like weblab.2/questions-2. So why don't we get started? So if you had time to look at the code, so first let's look at the navbar.css. So these are the 2 styles that you should have found, and you had to rename them, right? Because if you saw the previous slide, it told us how to rename them. So why don't we do this together? So I'm going to start by opening up oldstyles.css. And it's this giant CSS style sheet that has a bunch of styles for different containers, right? Around line 25, you should see 2 styles, nav container and nav title. So I'm going to copy these. So we're in oldstyles.css and line 25, copy these 2 styles. And we're going to open up under client, go to your component folder. In modules, go to navbar.css. It should be empty and it should tell you what to do and how to rename them. So I'm going to copy them in here, but we have to rename them, right? So when we rename them, we have to first put the component name. So this is for navbar. I'm going to do capital N nav, capital B bar, dash, and then lowercase c container. And then we're going to do the same thing for nav title, navbar dash title. So we're only focused on these 2, right? And so That's the two styles that we need for navbar.css. Oh, someone asked a question. Oh, great question. We actually have, so app.js is like the higher level component, and it has its own style sheet. Or actually, I think it's even, utilities.css. This is where it's defined. So this is like inside your source folder. This is already set up for you, but there's a utilities.css file in your source folder. So we just implemented navbar-container. The way we still put the period for CSS styles, and then we put the component name, so it's navbar, and then we do dash title or dash container for each component. So that's the first step. Now let's move on to implementing the HTML side of it, right? So the second part of this exercise is to implement the navbar. So you should have found the 3 lines of code in old index.html that are wrapped around the nav HTML tag, right? And what you have to do is import them or include them in the return statement. So remember that the parentheses, whenever we use them in JavaScript, they allow us to create a mini HTML environment. So that's what's going on here. And the other thing is when we're using classes, remember to access CSS classes, we use class name because class is already reserved in JavaScript for like JavaScript classes. So React uses class name instead. To do that, I'm going to open up old index.html. Around line 10 and through line 12, you should see the nav tag, and it has this class. So this is what it looks like in HTML. And we're going to open up the navbar.js, which is in source or client, source, component, modules, navbar.js. And we can just delete this code here. And we're going to put navbar, so nav here, right? But remember, there's a couple of things we still need to do. So we need to rename class to class name. So this is like the attribute. And then we have to rename the name of it, right? Remember how there's a certain styling that we follow in React, and it's usually the component hyphen the style name, right? So we define them here as navbar-container and navbar-title. So we're going to do that here. I'm going to rename this to navbar-lowercase c container and navbar-title. And there you go. Is it still worked when I, so it might though, I think like React has kind of evolved to like say, oh, okay, like he meant to put class name. This is just more like the standard use that says use class name. And sometimes it might throw you an error in the console that says, hey, you use class, did you mean to use class name? And then is that the renaming convention? Is the renaming a convention? Absolutely. It's more of a convention. Like in theory, you could just leave it as like the old title. But it's pretty much standard when you're building React that you create the style name based on the component name and then hyphen and then like whatever the style name is. But it would in theory still work if you named it whatever, and as long as the names match. But yeah. So let's see how our changes work, right? So when we hit save, we see our hot loader compiled successfully. So we're going to go back to our Chrome tab. Where did it go? Oh, no, I think I put it behind you. Yep, here's Chrome tab. And so now the nav bar shows up, right? Before it didn't, and now it does. We see the nav bar and it has cat hook, right? So that's kind of a cool, nice step of setting up the nav bar. So you just all wrote your own React component, which is pretty exciting. So if you're a little bit stuck, don't worry, we can get on the same page. Now you want to run these two commands. We're going to check out to the next step. So run git reset hard, and then git checkout w2 step 1. And what this is going to do is it's pretty much going to include the solution for the starter exercises. I'll leave it up maybe for like 15 more seconds. Git reset hard. And then, and you want to do this you want to do this in a new terminal. I guess I should have mentioned that. You want to keep the hot loader running. Yes, there's already questions about that. You can open up a new terminal. I can actually show you how to do that. So for here, there's two ways you can do it. There's this plus button, but it'll open it kind of like in a new window. But there's also this like split terminal button icon here that lets you basically create them side by side. But if you did the plus, it'll probably show up as like 2, and it'll tell you like you're in the next one, right? I like the side by side one because it helps. It's kind of cluttered right now because the font size is huge, but it's just to help you out. So I'm going to do git reset -- hard. So it kind of undid those changes, but we're actually going to check out to the next step. So it includes those changes. So git, and notice actually when it changed, it automatically compiled. So great question on if we should do them in separate terminals. It's pretty standard that you'll be working with multiple terminals. So I'm doing git checkout w2-step1. It's pretty common that you'll be using multiple terminals. And when we start working with servers, you'll definitely need to be using multiple. But for now, having 2 is totally okay. The one on the left has your hot loader, and the one on the right you can use to run git commands or any other command line actions. So you should see that the solution is here. I think it's also updated in navbar.css. So that's great. Cool. So now that we're on step 1, now we want to introduce the cat happiness component, right? Remember, the goal is so that way the cat happiness tells us like the value of how happy our cat is. And when we click on the picture, it gets more happy. It's kind of like how Buka Buka works, but on a very low level and not as advanced as Johan has over-engineered Buka Buka. But so to do that, first, let's look at the skeleton for cat happiness. So now we want to open up the cat happiness component. To do this, this is in the components folder, and then go to modules. So this should be in the same folder where your navbar was. So open up cat happiness, and you should now we see a component with a constructor, right? It has props and calls super props and initialize it with the component superclass. And then it has a return statement, right? And it has kind of these predefined styles that we've already written for you all. And notice it has that same convention where it takes like the name of the component hyphen, and then it has like the style name, right? Container, story content, right? And then the p tag, by the way, is just like for a paragraph, so it's just like text, and then the divs are used for like block elements. So for this exercise is now we want to start adding state, right? Remember we talked about accessing state and then updating state. So we are going to run the first thing we want to do is now we want to look at the component tree for catbook. And I think it might even give you a little message in the profile page on like how to include it, right? So remember, let me see if I still have it open. So app.js has the app and the profile, which is very similar to what we saw in the component tree. And then inside profile is where we want to include, it tells us to include cat happiness component there. So that's very similar here. We have our app that has a navbar and a profile, and then the profile has cat happiness. So where do we think the state of cat happiness should live? So this is so of all these components, right? Remember the way that cat happiness works is that when we click on the picture exists in profile, it will update the value of the cat happiness counter, which is in the cat happiness component. So anyone have an idea on where to include the cat happiness state? Where do we want to initialize this, the variable that will represent the state of our cat happiness? Someone said profile, cat happiness. Yeah, so the answer is actually profile, right? And so this sounds a little bit confusing, like why? Like this is a cat happiness value, shouldn't it be inside cat happiness? The reason why is that we're doing two interactions, right? When you click on your profile picture, which exists in the profile page, we want to update the value inside the cat happiness component. Right? And here, cat happiness just represents like the box that shows like 0 and 1 and 2 from the demo, right? So by doing this, the reason why it's in profile is because we have two different components that are interacting with cat happy, that are interacting with this value, right? And we want to store it in the most like the common ancestor among those two, right? So the picture exists inside profile, and the cat happiness like value where we're gonna put it is in the cat happiness component. So profile is kind of like this shared common ancestor between the actual image element and then the cat happiness component. So we're going to choose to initialize it in the profile page. And so here's kind of what it looks like, right? So remember that information gets passed down using the component tree. So the profile component that is the parent to the cat happiness component. So the profile component is going to hold the state of cat happiness, which is like an integer, and it's going to pass it as a prop. We'll call it cat happiness down to the cat happiness component. So that way this cat happiness component knows what value to show, right? Because here's where we're kind of maintaining and updating it. And we can pass this information as a prop downwards to any child component. And in this case, we created a cat happiness child component that will accept that prop, and it'll, in the render statement, will actually be able to show the value. So let's kind of walk through how we do that. So first of all, where do we initialize state? Can anyone tell me? Do we do inside constructor or render? One, construct. Yep, the correct answer is constructor. We always initialize state in constructor, and then we can access it and update it in render or in any other function we declare. But we always initialize state inside constructor. So why don't we open up the constructor? This is actually in profile.js, this code snippet. So open up profile.js. So this is in source / components / pages, and it should be profile.js. And you want to add these 3 lines of code. To initialize state, remember state is an object. So we do this dot state is equal to the bracket to represent a JavaScript object. And we say cat happiness, and we assign the initial value to 0. So I'll give you maybe like 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then we'll walk through it together. Remember, right now we're in profile.js. It's inside the pages folder of components, and you want to go to write these 3 lines of code. This dot state is equal to cat happiness 0. So here we are in profile. So I'm going to write this dot state is equal to, and we create a JavaScript object. And so we're creating this new variable, and we're going to create cat happiness, and we'll assign it to 0. This is just like how we write our component, semicolon at the end, comma, just because this is technically an object and there can be multiple keys and values. Right now it's just 1. So we've initialized the state, right? Now we want to connect the component. So we're in profile.js, we need to pass it to the cat happiness component. So remember from the lecture, we were talking about how every component needs to be exported and we import it from previous components. This is the way we do it. So if you're in profile.js, you want to write import. So that's how we import. Cat happiness is the name of the component, and we do from. So now we got to tell it where to get it from. And we have to basically find the path to cat happiness. And so you see all these dots, all these slashes, right? We're basically doing file navigation. That's what this is doing, right? So the 2 dots basically say, go to the folder above me. So we're currently in the pages folder. And these 2 dots are saying, go to the folder above. So I think that's components. Now we're in the components folder at this slash. It says, go into the modules component in the modules folder. So now we've gone from pages to components, and now we're into modules. And then it says, get the cat happiness.js file. And that's how we import cat happiness.js. This is very common if you've like imported other classes in like Java. Like you always like import the class from its location, things like that. So I'll leave this up maybe for like another 20 seconds. So I'm going to do it here where this is in the profile component. So because we're doing import cat happiness from, and then to get to there, we're going to do period, period. So 2 periods means go up a level from our current directory. And now we're going to go into modules. And then we hit / again to navigate even more. And it's going to be cat happiness.js. I like to do JS just as a personal preference. You know, it'll still work if you don't have it, but it's just my personal preference. So now we've imported it, right? But you highlighted it, and every VS Code is different, but here, because it's not like a brighter color, it's telling me I haven't used it, right? I've only imported it, but I haven't used it, right? And so how exactly do we want to do this, right? So the next exercise is, yep, that's fine. So the next exercise is that we want to pass down, or I think this might have skipped a step, but first we want to add the cat, or no, it's one step. First we want to add the cat happiness component in the profile.js, and we want to pass down the prop cat happiness. So just as a hint, remember we were talking about the 3 sections. There's the about me section, and then there's the my favorite cat section. You want to add a section in the middle that will hold our cat happiness component. And you probably want, my recommendation is you want to keep the styles consistent, right? So if you look at how the about me section is written and how the my favorite cat section is written, you'll see that they both have a profile.subcontainer div around them. You want to use something similar, right? And this is just an example of how we do reference components and pass in props. So we do the tag at the beginning. It's like the self-enclosed HTML tag. We put the name of the component. Here we're working with a cat happiness component. And then we put the prop name. We want to set the prop name equal to cat happiness. And then we want to set it equal to whatever the variable we just initialized in our state. And so the brackets allow us to reference JavaScript objects. And if you remember from lecture, we access state by using this .state. So I'll maybe give you like 30 seconds, and then we'll kind of walk through it together. But if you're just catching up, we are in the profile.js file. We initialize the state of cat happiness in the constructor. And then we imported the cat happiness component at the very top of the file. And now we want to reference that file and pass in a prop. And the prop we want to pass in is cat happiness. And the thing about the component, right? It has a self-enclosing tag. So that basically means we don't have to open the tag and then include a closing tag. We can do the / at the end that basically says this is self-enclosing, meaning it doesn't have anything inside it or underneath it. There's no child components to this. We're just referencing it once. So maybe like another 10 seconds, I'll leave this up. And then if you're still not sure what to do, that's totally okay. We're gonna walk through it together. But try to like look at how the about me and the favorite cat sections were written and try to copy it and then replace the inside content with the cat happiness component. Alrighty, so why don't we get started. So if you look at the render function, right, it actually tells you like right here, insert cat happiness component here, and hint, you probably want to add a profile subcontainer to hold the cat happiness component. So let's do that, right? So the first thing we notice is why don't we create the container that's going to hold it? So that's just a div, and we want to add a class attribute. So we have the opening div and the closing div. We want to set class name is equal to profile. We're going to use the same style names as I'm just reading it from here. So profile.subcontainer and then space u.textCenter. What the space is doing is it's basically saying we have 2 classes that we want to apply. Like, so this style might be adding styles that are specific to the subcontainer, and this is a utility class that's centering the text. And when we separate them by a space, it's basically saying apply both of them here. And then in here, we want to introduce cat happiness. So it's actually different. Oops, I misspelled it. And we want to, so this is how we define it, right? But so we reference the component, right? But we want to pass in the prop, right? And our prop is going to be cat happiness, lowercase c, capital H. And we say equals, And then we want to reference our state variable up here, right? So we're in HTML code right now, but we want to access the JavaScript variable. So to do that, we use the brackets, right? And notice that they're blue. And so inside here, we can do this dot state dot cat happiness. And you hit save, and that's pretty much what you need. This is in profile. We're not done yet, but this is in profile. No one seems to be answering. Oh, maybe the staff can, if someone on staff can look at the overflow doc. If the process for creating cat happiness was really difficult, lots of calculations, and we would be doing something different. Instead of creating a new cat happiness every time you render. That's an interesting question. Well, all we're doing is that we'll kind of show how it goes. The way that the calculation is really when you click on the picture, and the picture is defined in the same component. It's actually this component here, the avatar. When we click on that avatar, this should update, right? That's why we initialize the state here. I don't know. When it re-renders, it does. So when a component re-renders, it doesn't clear the state. It's re-rendering because we've updated the state, right? So when we hit re-render, it's not setting our cat happiness back to 0. The state is kind of, but like when you like refresh the page, right? Then it loses state, right? But if you're only re-rendering the component, then it's re-rendering because the state changed. So it's going to take the new state and display that. I don't know if that answered your question. Maybe ask it on the questions doc. But yeah, so let's look at our hot loader. So our hot loader should still be running. So let's go to localhost 5000. So I still have it open here. And now we see that it should have live updated. If it didn't, just hit save on profile.js, and you should see this come up, right? So now we have this like box here, right? But there's nothing in it, right? That's because we actually need to tell the cat happiness child component what to do with the prop. So we passed it in a prop. Now we pass the prop to the child. Now we have to go to the child and tell the child what to do with that information. Let's move on here. So now, oh wait, yeah. So this is how we wrote the cat happiness component. We imported it. Yeah, if you want to add a title, you can call it cat happiness, call it subtitle, header forward. It's optional. I didn't just because I'm focusing on the cat happiness right now. And we use the brackets to reference a JavaScript variable, this.state.cat happiness. Are we done? As we said, no. The child component is still missing its value. So the next part of the exercise is to use this incoming prop. So now let's open up cat happiness. So remember, this is in source/component or client/source/components/modules. And what you want to do, I think there's like a to-do statement in the paragraph line. Try to see if you can access the value of the prop in that line. And I'll give you a hint that you don't need to declare a variable inside render or inside constructor to hold it. It's already accessible to you that you can do it in one line. So maybe take 30 seconds to see how can you access the cat happiness prop from here. So we're in cat happiness.js, and all we need to do is get the value that's passed into it. So I'm going to show you here. So let's open up cat happiness. It's in the modules folder. And notice how it gives us the to do, right? Insert the cat happiness counter. Well, so we pass it in as a prop here. So we can access it by doing this .props cat happiness, lowercase c. And this matches with whatever attribute we passed in at the parent. So you should be writing this .props.happiness with the brackets. You need the brackets because we're accessing the JavaScript variable inside HTML code. And this name has to match, right? Because props is an object. So we're basically finding a key called cat happiness in that object. And so if the spelling is incorrect or if it doesn't match, then it's just going to be undefined because it's like you're trying to access something that doesn't exist. So hit save there. And then when we go to our hit save, and then I think it's behind here. Now it shows up. Now we have the 0, right? Because it's referencing what we passed in. And if you remember, the initial state of cat happiness is 0. And so our demo, our end goal is really to get this to update, right? We want, whenever we click on the picture component, we want it to update the number. So I think that's the end of step 1. So yeah, this .props the cat happiness is how we accessed it. So now let's get on the same page. So do git reset hard and git checkout w2-step 2. So leave this for like 15 seconds. And if you're stuck or something's not working, definitely ask on the questions doc, web.lab.2/questions, or add yourself to the queue and you can join a breakout room for one of the staff members to help you out. Yeah, Yassine's comment about server-side. Yeah, so eventually, like, you might want to store this information on a server in a database. So that's where you would do more of the calculation, and all we have to do is just make a request to get that information. But that's a little. We'll be talking about like requests when we talk about servers later this week. For now, it's just a state variable. So I'm going to run this on my computer, my VS Code. So back in the other terminal window, remember the first one should still have the hot loader running. We're in the other one, do git reset --hard. And so it's kind of going to like remove all the changes we did, but we're just going to check out to w2-step 2, and that will have the changes we just made. So if we see cat happiness as this .props.cat happiness, and I think the solution should have the H4. Yeah, it added an H4 element, the subtitle for cat happiness. Kind of optional, but just keeps it consistent design-wise. So this is kind of the last step. Now we want to update the state, right? And we need to change the cat happiness value when we click on the picture, right? So first, we want to create a function that will increment cat happiness for us, right? And we want to define this function in the same component that maintains the function, right? So increment cat happiness, you wouldn't want to do it in the cat happiness component because the value isn't maintained there. It's maintained in the profile. So that's why we do it inside the profile. And all we're doing is using the cat happiness component to nicely display the value, and we pass it in as a prop. So I can't remember if this code is already there for you or not. Oh, it is, yeah. So the starter code has already defined the function for you. Increment cat happiness is a function. It doesn't take any parameters, uses this arrow syntax in the brackets to execute this function. And your goal is to implement the function to update the state when the user clicks on the picture. So first, what we want to do is we want to basically say, how do we update the state? Now, if you're with us from the lecture, what we do, remember, we can't do like this.state equals this, or we can't immediately reassign it, right? And this won't work partly because remember, there's a lot of stuff going on when we update state. When we call a set state, or when we try to update the state, it's going to do a lot more than just changing the value. It has to re-render this component. It has to render all the child components. And there's a whole request. So what we have to do is we have to tell, hey, React, I'm making a request for you to change the state. And React will always accept it unless like you do something that like breaks the state or makes infinite calls to set state. I'll be like, okay, give me your request and I'll process the state change and I'll make sure to re-render your component. I'll make sure to re-render any of the children. So this is not the right way to do it. The correct way to do it is using this .set state, and it takes in, it's a function that takes in our object, right? And there's other ways to implement it. I think tomorrow, Kai and Claire are going to be talking about using like the previous state to update the current state, and using a callback function. For now, we're just going to do a very simplistic way. This still works, but just know that there's a better convention that exists that you don't need to know for now, but we'll get into later. And we're updating it to have cat happiness as our key. And then our value is this.state.cat happiness +1. So we're always incrementing it by 1. You can change it. It can be +5, +10. You can change it on your own and it should update. But yeah, so I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm just gonna quickly go through this. So we're gonna delete this line of code. We're gonna put this dot set state, and we're gonna take in a function, and we're gonna pass in an object to it, right? And we basically want to say, update the cat happiness value to be the current value, this dot state dot cat happiness plus 1. And that's all this function does. Increment cat happiness is all it's doing, right? You can do more logic in here. You can do console.log statements if you want. But for now, we're only updating the state. So we've defined this function. And now we have to tell it to say, OK, when you click on the profile picture, it should execute that function, right? And we mentioned event listeners yesterday, and that's what we're going to continue to do in React. So React uses a bunch, it still uses event listeners, but it does it in a much cleaner way. If you remember from yesterday, we had to do like button.add event listener, and then you have to put like parentheses click to indicate we're doing a click event listener, and then you have to do the callback function to indicate what to do. Here it's a little bit easier. We can actually just tell the div element that there's an on-click attribute. It's capital C, so on-click in React. I think in HTML it's just lowercase c, but in React we do uppercase C. And you can set it equal to this function. So there's a couple ways we can do that. The first way we can do it is that when we set on-click to the avatar container, and we're doing the one that's in line 23 of profile.js, on-click will actually, you can define a function inside it, right? So we define an arrow function, and inside this function, it'll execute this .increment cat happiness, which is fine. It still works, right? But if you realize what we're doing is we're just defining a function that will execute another function. So we're kind of creating this middle function that is a lot of more work, right? What we can just shorthand it and reference it, right? This .increment cat happiness, right? That's the function. Does this work? Anyone have a quick idea? It should not. Yeah, it probably doesn't. Yep, it does not work. So the reason why it doesn't is because we have these parentheses right here. And so what it's doing is that it's actually saying inside this JavaScript environment, execute this dot. We're saying run this function, run this .increment cat happiness. But we don't return anything. So it's going to execute, and it's going to be null or void or undefined, right? So then when we say on click is equal to undefined. So when you try to click on it, it's not going to do anything. So the correct way to do this is to just exclude the parentheses and just reference the function, reference the name of the function. So it takes in, so now we're seeing, this is what we call a callback function. We're passing in a function as an input. We're telling it that when you click, execute this function, this .increment cat happiness. And so yeah, so if you're setting the attribute of a function, make sure you're referencing the definition or reference of a function, but you're not actually executing it. So this is kind of the summary that we saw. I'm just going to speed through this because I know Noah's going to go after this. Here we defined an arrow function, so that works. It was just kind of unnecessary though. This is the correct way to do it because we just referenced a function. And this one will not work because we included the parentheses. So it's saying execute before you add the event listener. So this is the correct way to do it. So I'll just show you quickly how to do it on here. In the avatar container, we can do on click is equal to, and then we reference the name. So this dot increment cat happiness. And when you run your hot loader, when you click on it, you should see it updating. So that is pretty much it. If you want to see the complete version of the workshop, you can do git reset hard and go to git checkout w2 complete. You should still have the hot loader running, so you can play around with it. Localhost 5000 is where you want to go on Chrome, and you should see it update. Yes, update. Yep, yeah, so when we add the on-click, we're adding it to whatever element it is. So that includes the box. But if you want to include it to only the circle, then you would do the element inside. If you want to do it to the whole app, and you can add it there. But yeah, you can go to this link. I won't show it just because we're kind of close. But if you're still confused on anything, we have office hours tonight. Come check us out. The questions doc is still there. The help queue is there. And yeah, if you have any questions on ideation, Git, wireframing, anything we talked about, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, I think Noah's going to talk about APIs and async right now. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone. And if you have any questions, definitely add it to the help doc. And if you still need help on this workshop, come to office hours later tonight. Yeah, Noah, you're welcome to go.
All right, so ta-da, if I can get my windows to work how they're supposed to. All right, so yeah, now that we've done all this lovely workshop stuff, it's time to take a step back, relax for just a sec, and focus a little more on some lecture material. So now we've made a lot of mentions to kind of this whole dynamic of front end, back end, stack, all this voodoo magic terms that we kind of haven't explained yet. And so this is where I come in to, you know, just take up the slack of everything else. The young infant, I get to cover all of this. Anyways, but so for the most part, we've been dealing with all of these front end type things that you get to see. Everybody cheers for them. It's like, oh, it's so beautiful. Your CSS is magical. These people on the back end, they don't get all the love they deserve. So for this lecture, we're kind of going to focus a little more on the unseen, the back end, the unsung heroes, the ones that keep your data safe and working. And but kind of before we can dive deep into what the back end style is, we kind of got to talk about clients and servers because they're truly like the heart of our backend. So your client showing you your lovely front end, you're this lovely man here sitting here on your laptop with your Chromebook, and you're, let's say, doing some Google search. So here we have this actually wonderfully colored Google server room here. I'm kind of jealous. You know, I'd like this whole color theme for my room. But so all of this data is sitting in these servers here. And you don't necessarily have to think of a server as these big rooms. In fact, actually later on, like even a day from now, I think tomorrow or something, we set up some basic server. Your server will be running on your own devices, because it's important to note that the server is just simply where the data and stuff for your site exists. And so you can sit here in Chrome, you can sit in Firefox, you can sit in Safari. For the love of God, do not sit in Internet Explorer. But the point is your client will make requests all over the globe for the data of your site. And that's kind of the whole background of how our internet client server dynamic works. Your client will make requests to your server, and your server will send back responses. That's the key heart concept that we're going to hit you with a brick repeatedly until you can chant it in your sleep. Clients do some lovely requests, and your servers do responses. So that's all that really happens when you type links and things into the address bar. So once again, clients, requests, servers, responses. We're just going to milk that as much as we can. And so, but we can go in a little more detail than just request and response. So how you specifically access information from servers on the other side of the planet, I can tell you it isn't through email or anything like that. You don't just email some Google dev, hey, give me site. No, we have specific types of requests and responses that you've seen pretty much all of your life, assuming you haven't lived under a rock. It's at the beginning of every, or just about every URL that you've probably typed in your life. This HTTP and HTTPS. So HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You might notice that the hypertext is both a part of the HTTP and HTML acronyms because they're kind of sort of related here. They're both they're methods of transferring quickly the information that we need, hypertext. And HTTP will deliver these HTML files. And so you've been doing HTTP requests and responses. Your browser's been handling it for you this whole time. You just haven't quite known it. And so here is this whole magical, complicated thing that is an HTTP request in a single image. It's composed of a few distinct components. So your HTTP request will have its request URL, the specific site that you make your request to. In our case, it'll be catbook2021.herokuapp.com or something like that. And we'll cover each individual component of this a little more in depth in the next few slides. But you'll have your method, your headers, and your body kind of sort of optionally. And additionally, just as a side note, this isn't too important for the moment, but it will become very important later. There's the query part of the request URL that generally causes some confusion. But when we implement specific stuff, you can click this link, and I think it's one of Oxaj's comments. I just picked a random one. But so the query bit is a part of some requests that allow you to query for specific specific things, including which comments, which stories, that type of deal. And so now we can cover the that second part of the HTTP block, the method. So there are, I think, a little over a dozen unique methods, but you'll only focus on like 4 or 5 of them at most. For the most part, you'll actually not go too much further than just these 2. So a GET request is fairly self-explanatory. It gets data. A POST request will make data. A PUT request will modify some data, and delete, of course, deletes data. And as per usual, MDN is your friend and will list all of the HTTP methods that exist today. And so what about those other 2 chunks? So as stated before, the HTTP will request its method and its destination. The body can be used to give content. So when you wish to add a new content, that will wish to add a new comment, you'll make a post request to the site, and you'll have to obviously provide the comment that you make, and that will be passed along in the request body. And the header can be used to do a little fancier stuff. I'll try and show a few examples of exactly what the header has, but it generally has a few extra details like authentication type things. If you're trying to access something that shouldn't be seen by normal people, it'll have what browser you're using. That way it knows how to give it back to you and whatnot. And so speaking of giving it back to you, now we've talked about requests. Now we can talk about responses. So responses are pretty similar to requests. One of the key differences here is that your response will have status codes. And status codes exist as 100 something, 200 something, 300 something, 400 something, 500 something. And they'll tell you how your request went. And you've probably seen at least a few different status codes. Somebody want to spam in chat. We got one already. What status codes have you seen? 404. We got one of them. 403. That's another one. 5. Okay, yeah, this is going to get out of hand quick. So yeah, those are definitely all status codes that exist and are somewhat kind of common. So I like that 404 was the first one because 404 is the first one in my slides. So yeah, 404. Each of the status codes usually also have like a 2 or 3 word description after them. So generally when we say 404, we mean 404 not found. And so that just simply means that you make a GET request for a site that doesn't exist. The server will respond back to you saying, hey, that doesn't exist, and it will have, along with its response, a status code of 404 attached to it. Additionally, there are some good status codes. We got 200 OK. So this is the one you probably have seen most often in your life, but you never really realize it because your browser doesn't have to tell you things went okay because your site actually loaded. It doesn't have to tell you that things went okay. So you never actually generally see 200 OK plaster across your screen. No, you only ever see things when things go wrong. It's kind of like why back-end engineers are never appreciated. You only ever realize they exist when you're trying to hate on them for something that went wrong. Anyways, but we also have internal server errors. It's really hard to find these niche memes that are modernized. So enjoy like the 12-year-old pixelated memes I've thrown in throughout this. So iconhascheeseburger.com at the bottom left there. And then we also have 400 bad requests with the pixel quality of 2008. Even though that meme came out like 2017, 16, something like that, a Drake meme there. Anyways, but to kind of summarize the status codes, so 100 is informational, 200 is some sort of success status code, 300 is special status codes that I've summarized as like redirect, but it's difficult to 1 word, 2 words summarize exactly what the 300 status codes are. 400 status codes are something you did wrong, and 500 status codes are something the server did wrong. But for the most part, you only have to focus on the 200s, the 400s, and the 500s, as generally you won't ever see the 300s, and I don't even think I've ever seen a 100 status code. But they tell me it exists, so I have to tell you about it. And there are meme status codes. Twitter has a 420 status code, and somebody else has like a 409 My Little Teapot or something like that. Yeah, web developers are really funny. So you can see some of those status codes at the link I've thrown down below. Yes, that was sarcastic, Claire. So all of these requests that you've been making, all of these status codes, all of this stuff has been out of sight, out of mind. So one thing I kind of want to do is bring it back into sight and bring it back into mind. So what I want everybody to kind of do is open up a page, maybe like Capbook. And what we can do is we can go to the lovely developer section using Control-Shift-I or Command-Shift-I, or hopefully you don't have a different shortcut than that. And there will be a network tab. I'll give an example in a sec. And if you refresh the page, you'll see all the requests that are made to load the site. Now, because I don't feel like exiting present and doing it myself, I just have a saved screenshot of me doing it with Catbook because I'm lazy. So you'll see there are requests for all of the comments. They have 304 status codes. I told you those wouldn't really happen all that often, but here's like 70 of them. Whoops, I lied. And so, oh, Noah's G502 mouse needs to lock its scroll wheel. And then there's like a 200 down here for the favicon. There's a 200 for this iframe. You'll see that there are just a bunch of requests. If I scroll through this, if the Google slides thing, yeah, there were 101 requests that happened in a span of 1.13 seconds. That's kind of a lot there. And so we can actually make a couple of requests ourselves, and I will leave present for this. So here's a short request here that happens in 74 milliseconds. It's literally just to weblab.mit.edu/yeet. Sadly, we don't have a /yeet. I will fix that in due time. This is what your browser will do for you automatically. You can see that there are some headers here. This is the response headers. As I said before, the response will look pretty identical to a request, just with things like status codes. So the header includes some information like the date, the server that replied to us, the exact length of the response, and the type of response. We can see that it sent us an HTML-based response. So you've probably seen this page at least once or twice in your life. But that's not the only request I got. I have another one. So I don't remember where I found this, but if anybody can read this, tell me what it says. So here's a request to some ASCII art page. It's some giraffe ASCII art. I was too lazy to find some other request. You've been making these requests all these times, but they've just hidden from you all of this information that you never knew existed. And so before I go too much further, if you have too many questions, you can go to the questions doc, weblab.2/questions. There's also the queue, and there's also Zoom chat that I kind of sort of monitor. So if you want to spam me, you can. But I don't see too many Zoom chat questions, so I'm just going to continue along like normal. So I did kind of ignore one aspect of that last screenshot. You can see, if you look really closely, there are tiny blue lines that separate each of these requests, and they're also like on top of each other. Like, what happens? We're making all these 100 requests at the exact same time. How does that work in the code world? So as everybody's been saying, that's the async part of things. So almost everything up until now has been a synchronous type of code. If you've done a lot of coding before and it's not been web dev, it's probably been synchronous. And that essentially means that everything that you've called, gets executed, finishes, and then the next thing goes. So you can be relatively certain that if you call something, it will finish, do all it's trying to do before the next thing is called. And so it can't go on until the thing before it finishes. But that's not exactly too helpful for us in the web dev world. Sometimes we want things to be out of order and to be asynchronous. And so in the asynchronous world, we can't guarantee the order in which specific commands finish. So more concretely, why we want async. So you can see this little graph here is pretty similar in nature to this one. So rather than having them back to back, we can cram all of our load time into a much smaller package by having multiple things happen at the exact same time. Just we can't guarantee that it will happen in the order 1, 2, 3, 4 anymore. In fact, this one will happen 3, 2, 1, 4. But let's concretely attach stuff to it. Let's say 1 is some sort of request of some kind. 2 is a button press that then executes a color change, and then an array search happens. So in a synchronous world, your button press can't be registered, the color change can't happen, the array search can't happen until the request is finished first. In the asynchronous world, we can go ahead and let that request do whatever it's trying to do, but at the same time, we can go ahead and do our button press, we can do our color change, we can let the user do what the user wants to do while all that slow internet stuff happens in the background. And so we've talked on a high level what async is, but we haven't really said how we do async, at least on a concrete level. So here I have some function, get data, then call this, that just makes a GET request. And before and after it, I have some more synchronous type things that just log A, B, and C. And so what I want you to do is place your bets on the exact order that these 4 things get called. Zoom chat, spam me now. What's your bet? Is it going to be the A, get request, B, C, ABC get, CB get A, or get ABC? Come on, somebody spam me in Zoom chat. All right, I don't think I saw anybody get it wrong yet. So, yeah, so it's going to be the A, B, C get request, because the get request has to go to, I think this is German or Dutch or something, so this GET request is going to that server that is somewhere in the middle of Eastern Europe there, and then it's coming all the way back. And obviously, I think that's going to take just a little longer than console logging to my Chrome console. I think there's just a few more steps involved there. So naturally, because that's asynchronous, all this console logging is going to happen for us before. You can see it happens 9, 11, 12, 6. I didn't really write the code in order, it seems. But so we can see that it happens out of order there. And so, of course, I have yet another pixelated meme. But yeah, so asynchronous stuff doesn't happen in order once again. So we got 3, 2, 7, 4, 6, 1, 9, 10, 5, and 8. Funny 2016 Twitter developer meme. And so as yet another slight little aside, because we'll talk about them a little bit later, is promises. Promises are a specific implementation of, good luck sending it to anybody without being compressed, Emmy. So promises are a specific implementation of the of doing asynchronous type things. And so they exist to simplify the look of your async code and make error handling quite a bit simpler. You'll wonder how you ever lived without them. And I'm trying to be the best Billy Mays that I can be and sell you on this. So I'm not going to try and cover all the things that promises can do, and the complicated things you can do with promises. But consider that thing I had you place your bets on earlier. So the way I would do that in promises type way is I would do this get request, and then I have a dot then. So this dot then is all that really exists to this basic promise. So we know that this get request to memelink.com, I don't know what exactly exists there, but we know that the get request to this site is going to take some time. So we're going to let it do its thing, and then kind of in a Pythonic way, we're going to say dot then. It reads exactly as you would say it in a sentence. We're going to get the stuff here, dot then, with the response, we're going to log the status code of the response. But promises, they have 3 states. We have a pending promise, a fulfilled promise, or a rejected promise. I think it would be a lot funnier if they wrote it as a broken promise, but web developers aren't that fun either, apparently. Once you either fulfill or reject your promise, it stays that way, and you can chain multiple promises together. So if I can append yet another dot then to the end of this dot then, and I can end up with a whole 60 long dot then chain. That would be terrible. Please don't do that. But you can. And so with the async stuff kind of out of the way, now we can talk about the first part of that lecture title of APIs and async. I should retitle this lecture. So the first bit of that, APIs, stands for Application Program Interfaces. So APIs are a set of endpoints. I will say what endpoints are in just a sec, that you can make requests to. So companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, they all provide these magical APIs, and they allow others to implement their services. So these specific endpoints, we're going to actually create these endpoints that I have at the bottom, I think on Friday. I have yet another lecture. You're not done with me yet. So if you hate me, well, you got to endure me for 2 more lectures. But when you go to a URL, you are making a request to an endpoint. So the endpoints that we'll implement later, one of them will be this /API/stories, which will accept GET requests. Then we'll have another one /story that accepts POST requests. But some endpoints can take multiple types of requests. And they do different things based on what type of request that they receive. So we'll have a endpoint /API/comment that either gets a specific comment if you send it a GET request, or it will create a comment for a specific story if you send it a POST request. And so I noticed in the Google Questions doc, like 3 or 4 of you asked about this Google Maps stuff and how we implemented ourselves. Well, ta-da, that's what I'm here for. So this random restaurant that I've never been to but apparently exists in Boston, I don't imagine the web developer that worked on this restaurant site is an engineer for Google. I don't really think the guy is. But somehow this person has created a embedded Google Maps type thing. Now this person doesn't really have access to any Google servers directly. So how has this person access the vast Google Maps data? And well, in short, the answer is APIs. So the purpose of an API, you need to act. Sometimes we, as normal mortal human beings, wish to access the data of our corporate overlords like Facebook and Google. But you yourself will eventually have an API. So it's not just limited to the corporate world, but that's all the cool APIs. So you need to access data, and you're not going to directly access data on servers. That's inconvenient and not really great for all the security people that work at Google. So the whole point of these APIs is that they provide these structured places, endpoints, that you can send requests to. And so now you can do a bunch of really cool things by simply asking the right people in a nice way. You can send them requests. And visually, all of us, we sit here on this mortal client realm, and we interact with this API, and this API is the only one that can give us the data, or you can tell the API to put data in there. And so it just makes things much easier by having one singular middleman, this API. And so there are a butt ton of cool APIs that are a little underappreciated. So there's the Google Maps stuff I mentioned a moment ago. There's also the dog API. I discovered this one yesterday. I was happy about it. So the dog API, every time you do it, it's going to send back to you this response that will give you a dog, a lot of details about a dog. It also provides pictures of said dog too. So this is the dog that this API just told us about. We love dogs. We love dogs. It's great. So that's one lovely API, and you can see every time I make a request to it, it gives us a whole bunch of different ones. But there's also more technical, not quite so simple APIs. The people over at OpenAI have cool balls to the wall APIs that do magical things well beyond my mortal understanding, that do things like text generation, custom image generation, things that you, in your at least 2-3 week span here at web.lab, if you manage to do that, well, I'm sure the sponsors will absolutely love you and pay you lots of money. But I don't expect any of you to be making something of the scale that OpenAI has done over the past few years. So I'm not telling you not to try, though. That provides ways for you to access things that they've made in lots of cool ways. And so I've shown you these random shady links and things because we've been talking this whole time. This backend is this invisible entity that nobody ever really gets to see or is happy. A personal story, I did an internship for JB Hunt, and I was the VR team. They had an intern team for VR devs, and they, at the end of the internship, they go and show off the stuff they've worked on all summer, and the VR team woos all the higher ups, and it's like, woo, this VR thing is really cool, even though it's not really useless. I want you to tell me how many people are going to throw on a VR headset to track their package. It's important to be appreciative of the API stuff. So I just wanted to share this particular API resource swagger.io, which allows a visualization of your APIs a little bit. So they have a standard API here, but you can throw your own APIs into Swagger to kind of collect all of your API endpoints into something that is a bit more manageable, and it allows in-house testing of things. So if you wanted to, you can make post requests to your local thing. You can get test responses. It's more a debugging type thing that you can probably hit me up in office hours if you want to try and set up. I don't really expect too many of you to have complicated enough APIs to necessitate this scale of thing, but it is a good tool to keep in mind for the future in your lovely API development careers. And that's pretty much all I have to say about APIs and stuff. I do want to throw some more quick notes because you cannot forget about it. There is indeed milestone 0 due tonight at 11:59 p.m. EST. Please do not get confused about time zones like I did and show up to the Zoom lecture an hour early. And then somebody has a Zoom recording of you sitting in your chair in a blanket, unhappy about having to be up so early. So don't forget your milestone 0. Shouldn't take you too long. Do it pretty much right now if you haven't done it already. Don't forget that there's office hours from 7 to 9 p.m. EST. Again, tonight, I'll probably be there. There will be a few of the other staff there at least. And also one extra thing, because we only had like 6 responses yesterday, be sure to check out the daily recap Piazza post for the Google feedback form. It definitely helps us quite a lot in keeping track of if we're going too fast, did Noah rival Eminem and rap through this entire presentation, or was he slower than the sloth in Zootopia? That's kind of for you to decide. Please roast us in this feedback form. We won't be salty at all. It is anonymous, so roast us. The more feedback that you can possibly give, the better. Oh gosh, more Oxshaj and the Moon Pond stuff. You know, I can meet you in the Moon Pond too. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got for today. Does any other staff member have something to shout at me that I may or may not be forgetting? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Should we all?
Well, for once, I think we've finished a little before our normal 5 o'clock time, so enjoy the extra 15 minutes to your nap before office hours. Is there a little homework tonight too? Checklist homework in React. Haha. Yeah, maybe also do that if you would like to get some extra React practice.
If anyone needs help like setting up stuff, I think staff will be here to hang around until like 5 if you need someone to help you debug. But yeah, other than that, y'all are free to go.
Thank you.
Hey, what is the checklist homework in React referring to?
We're going to share that in just a little bit. It'll basically be just basically another workshop, except it will be you doing it by yourself. So we'll provide some steps and give you some hints on how you can implement a checklist app in your browser.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
At staff, we should probably release the signups for Milestone 1 slots sometime tonight, right?
We have to do it after milestone 0 is completed because we don't know how many teams we need to.
So
count.
like 12:02.
Yes, 12:02. So we'll close the forum. Also, I saw someone here in the chat that got lost and wanted their team deleted. Can you make a private Piazza post and then Nick will probably handle that for you so you can join?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, because I don't know how to do that. Yes, Derek, you just have to be ready for your presentations. You will screen share them with us, so it's not submitted anywhere. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll release more
Thank you.
information about that. Mhm.
Thank you.
Just in case Mr. Emmanuel does not make the thing yet, Nick, it's Emmanuel. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that last name.
Wait, what?
The person that wants their team deleted,
Oh, got you.
because I don't know if they're in the Zoom call to have heard what Shannon said.
I think they
Um,
were.
Well, then they probably should still post on Piazza, because I feel like if it's not clear at this point, I don't know what I can do to help people realize that we like them we like it when they post on Piazza.
I don't know why we didn't.
Oh.
I don't know why we didn't hook Buka Buka up to Piazza rather than the Google Doc.
I
Are
get
you
on that.
feeling the...
Oh, Johan will get you ready.
Yes, please.
More
Johan.
over engineering.
Does Piazza
We
have
Stop
a,
streaming.
There's definitely a Piazza API.
yeah.
How do we stop streaming?
Oh, sorry, I'll do that.
I want to put the people in the reading room.
Bye, stream.
Bye, stream.